Chapter 344. The mercenaries that were sent to the Greyhill Mountains either never returned or brought back useless information. The mercenaries that were sent to Erwin's Southern Legion did not return. Brando knew that the mercenaries that were sent out were not necessarily reliable. Rabin, Cornelius, and Jutta all had their own plans, and most of the mercenaries just wanted to get by. Some of the mercenaries that were sent out immediately ran away. Brando was aware of this, but he did not intend to force them to stay. Only those who were willing to stay with him through thick and thin were trustworthy. Of course, Brando was not going to sit around and wait for his death. As the shadows of the war from the Paulus kingdom loomed over Tonajol, he arranged for his trusted men to continue searching for Erwin's Southern Legion through Schaflund. On the other hand, the construction of the fief was proceeding in an orderly manner. The construction of the city walls was finally completed at the end of the month of Frost. The construction period was a week later than expected, and the resources used were far more than expected. The only ones who benefited from this were the workers who were hired to repair the walls. In fact, the construction did not go as smoothly as expected. No one was willing to work for this young and illegitimate lord. Grodin's prestige was still intact, and Count Randner's reputation was even heavier in the hearts of the people. The originally agreed policy of appeasement was met with trouble almost immediately. Material benefits were not enough to overcome the fear of the old nobles, or the fear of revenge that would follow. Amandina quickly realized that if the mercenaries did not seal off Abies's surroundings, or if the commoners were not equally fearful of Brando, there would have been a mass exodus. After understanding this, she finally understood her mistake. She had no choice but to use force to make up for this mistake. In order to ensure the completion of the construction period, she even became a servant of the nobles. She personally led her men to the outskirts of the city and chased the commoners out of their huts. She ordered them to gather in the square and ordered the soldiers to give them tools. Then, she ordered the mercenaries to supervise their work. Of course, even though she tried her best to reduce the amount of violence in her work, it was still unavoidable. The title, Demon Lady, quickly spread among the commoners. That day passed in the midst of the workers coping and their resistance to the supervisors. But this change in attitude came after the first day of work. Out of everyone's expectations, the Demon Lady prepared a sumptuous dinner for them. Not only was there a rare white bread for dinner, there was even a stew. Of course, the stew did not live up to its name. It was so clear that there was only water and no meat. At a glance, it looked like a lake in the mountains. It was so clear that one could see the bottom. Amandina could not help but frown when she saw the pot of stew. But it was not because the mercenaries were harsh. The meat was obtained from the forest by the mercenaries. Even though there was a lot of meat, it was not enough for everyone to share. Amandina was originally worried that the workers would complain, but the development of the situation was completely out of her expectations. These refugees, who had been living in the slums all year round, could barely walk when they smelled the rich aroma of the broth. Their eyes became brighter than the hungriest wolf in the forest. In their eyes, white bread was a rare delicacy, and they could only get a little during festivals or on important days. As for meat, it was only at the end of the year. It depended on whether the Lord was in a good mood and would reward them with some leftovers. As for whether it was clear or not, it did not matter. In fact, when she saw the way the workers wolfed down the food, Amandina realized that she had made another mistake. She remembered the time when she was in Brugloss. She could only eat a little black bread every day, not to mention meat and fish. Amandina used the power of this dinner to calm the hearts of the workers. She said that as long as they stayed at the construction site, everyone would be able to eat such food every day. This promise almost caused a stir among the crowd. Although the workers were skeptical, most of them were willing to stay and see the situation. Not to mention that even if they did not want to stay, those fierce mercenaries would make the choice for them. However, their doubts were soon dispelled. The Mist Devil had indeed fulfilled her promise and allowed them to eat a piece of white bread and a small plate of stewed meat soup every night. The direct result of this was that the amount of meat in the warehouse quickly decreased because there was not much to begin with. The meat in the warehouse came from the domesticated livestock in the territory. Most of them were mutton or pork, and some of them had been marinated for a long time. In the past, the meat was provided for Grodin and his men, but now it was used to feed hundreds of people. Naturally, the supply could not meet the demand. Falerne complained to Amandine more than once, saying that if she continued to consume like this, their lord would not be able to eat a single meal when Brando returned. Amandine was moved by her words. On one side was the young lord whom she respected the most, and on the other side were the workers who came from the refugee camp. She did not have to think about it to choose the former. But after thinking about it again and again, she insisted on her own way. She asked the mercenaries to hunt in the forest as much as possible, and even put aside their daily training just to replenish their meat consumption. But this method brought about unexpected benefits. The workers gradually found out that the demon lady arranged for them to hunt in the forest outside the city in order to ensure that they would have enough for dinner. She even arranged for them to hunt in the old lord's private hunting grounds. This method moved everyone, and some even secretly asked the mercenaries to tell her that she did not need to spend so much money. In fact, it was already good enough to have white bread every day. The workers began to worry that the young lord would punish the kind and benevolent noble lady because of this. But their actions strengthened Amandina's confidence. Not only that, she also told the workers that it was not her, but the lord who arranged all of this, so they did not have to worry at all. Amandine used this small explanation to push all the credit to Brendel. Coupled with the fact that the young lord had reduced the taxes previously, he had gained a high reputation among the lower class for a short period of time. Of course, Brando did not know about this at that time. He was dealing with the matters of the mines in Schaflund and did not know what was happening in his territory. In fact, Amandine did not think that her actions would be successful at first. She did not have any experience in managing a territory, and only had a few short discussions with Brando during the journey. But she soon realized that she did not do anything wrong. Less than a week after the implementation of the corresponding countermeasures, someone asked her through the mercenaries if the Count needed more manpower. This was obviously a signal that her construction site could attract more workers. But that was not all. This meant that the old noble's authority and the new lord's authority were beginning to waver. This was no doubt a good sign. But the only thing that Amandine regretted was that the good sign did not change the fact that the construction project was delayed. On one hand, too much time was wasted in the beginning, and on the other hand, none of them were proficient in construction and engineering. Master Bosley's participation might have more or less made up for the lack of manpower, but the kingdom's blacksmith wasn't a true professional. He might have his own unique insights on how to craft a magical armor, but that didn't mean that he wasn't a true professional. But it was definitely not repairing a section of the wall. This dilemma was finally resolved when Odom, the old dwarf from Schaflund Mines, joined in. No matter how unreliable the old dwarf was, he had at least learned a few things from his fellow mountain dwarves. After correcting a few of the original misconceptions, the construction process quickly accelerated, and by the end of the month, it was finally completed. On the morning of the completion of the project, Amandine invited Brando, Medisha, the Shire, and all of the young man's trusted subordinates. Amandine, Scarlet, and Roman stood in the morning mist, quietly looking at the wall that was looming in the early winter mist. Amandine could not help but let out a long sigh. But then she frowned slightly and turned to look at Brando, who was also looking in the same direction. She said apologetically, "I'm sorry, my lord, for wasting so much time." Brando looked at his aide with eyes full of praise. He remembered that when he was in Bragg's, he felt lucky that he was able to find a subordinate who could create a mana-channeling device. This was undoubtedly something that made him happier than picking up gold by the roadside. But it was only today that he realized that he had not only picked up a treasure, but also a priceless treasure. Amandina was a quiet girl, but she had her own principles. Brando could see that she was determined to uphold her ideals and beliefs. He felt that he was worthy of having such an outstanding girl serve him wholeheartedly. After returning to his territory, he carefully understood the work of this noble girl. He was originally worried that Amandina, who had no experience in governing a territory, would run into a lot of trouble. He even estimated that the wall would take until next month. It would only be completed in the middle of the slumbering month. Even though it was not a big problem, it would be more or less inconvenient if it was delayed until the first snowfall. But Amandina gave him a big surprise. She completed the task with her usual seriousness and meticulousness, exceeding his expectations. Not only that, Bosley and Odom's performance was also satisfactory, with the exception of the old dwarf who seemed to be a little timid. He looked at Amandina and nodded with a faint smile of approval. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 345. What do you think? Brando suddenly asked. The young man asked Rabin and Cornelius, who were also standing in the fog, rubbing their hands and exhaling white smoke. After Janna's departure, these two commanders who had known each other for a long time had gotten closer. However, before Rabin and Cornelius met this young lord, they did not like each other. Therefore, the distance between people was actually a very subtle thing. After hearing the young lord's question, there was a moment of silence. But the first to speak was Romaine. Romaine had already changed into a thick winter coat and a pair of deerskin gloves. Even so, her face was still red from the cold. Even the tip of her nose was slightly red. Roman thinks it's good. What do you think, Brando? She exhaled a breath of white steam and said without any intention of scheming. She even turned to look at Brando with her eyes wide open, as if she wanted to see if he agreed with her words. The group of small mercenary group leaders immediately agreed. That's right, Cornelius added, it's unexpectedly good. Even though it's a little late, forgive me for being blunt. I've also participated in the midterm work, and to be honest, we're not too familiar with it. Lady Amandina has done very well. I wouldn't dare to say that it's perfect, but it's at least surprising. Everyone loved to hear flattery, and even Romaine could not help but look at this handsome silver-haired man. Even though she did not seem to agree with his flattery, she could not help but agree with him. She thought about how she had been through a lot in the past month. Almost every small decision she made could be met with an accident that she did not consider beforehand. However, it was precisely because of these unexpected situations that she became more and more proficient in handling them. Indeed, it's surprising. Rabin did not say much, and his words were concise. But Romaine still secretly looked at her lord. In her heart, the young man's opinion was enough to trump all opinions. This was the first time she felt her heart beat so fast, and she was afraid that she would see the slightest dissatisfaction on Brando's face. But she just happened to see Brando looking at her with unconcealed admiration, and she could not help but be startled. She did not know why, but she suddenly felt a lump in her throat. It was as if all her hard work over the past few months had paid off in this moment. She sniffled and turned her head away, lest she cried in front of so many people and make a fool of herself. At least she still remembered that she was Brando's #1 aide and the person in charge of the territory's affairs. She did not want to embarrass Brando. But when she turned her head, she saw Medisha pass a silk handkerchief over. The silver elf's movement was so subtle that almost no one noticed it. Romaine was a little startled and looked at Mishans gratefully before she took the silk. Brendel noticed his aide's actions and shook his head with a wry smile. Before I came here, he said, that night. His words silenced the scene. Almost everyone remembered that night that made their blood boil. It was as if they only realized what they had done a long time after the incident. They had killed the rightful lord of Erewhon under the instigation of a young man. No one had ever thought of such a thing in the past, and no one dared to think about it. But what they could not believe was that they really did it. It did not matter if they were provoked, incited, or threatened. In short, there was no turning back. Since then, a month had passed in the blink of an eye. But they did not collapse like they had feared. Now that the city wall was completed, it seemed to symbolize something. Perhaps under the leadership of this young man, they were indeed different from the ordinary rioters. As for the final result, since this young lord was so confident, what else did they have to worry about? You know, I actually did not think too much about what I wanted to do, Brando continued. Perhaps in your eyes, I am a noble, high, and mighty, but I do not think so. He said this sincerely. Of course, how many people would believe this truth was another matter. I came here, to go further south to inherit a piece of land that belongs to me. It came from my ancestors, Brando said half truthfully, half falsely. I did not intend to kill anyone, or take over their land, but in the education I received, there was a voice that told me that the meaning of the existence of nobles was to lead the people out of their predicament. Because they were better, received more education, and because they had this responsibility. Power and responsibility are equal. I believe you are familiar with this saying. Brando said. He nodded. That's right. This is what the late King Eric said. He reached out and pointed at everyone. Nobility is responsibility. Strength is responsibility. Power is responsibility. Power is responsibility. Before this, Brando continued. The surroundings were silent. Everyone looked at him, not understanding why this young lord would say such a thing at this time. Amandina also looked at him, and there was a strange light in her eyes. The spirit of the late king, the pursuit of Erewhon's lost glory, was what attracted her the most about this young lord. It was as if there was a fatal attraction that could make a girl's eyes shine. It was snowing. The snowflakes were faint at first, almost undetectable, like cold rain falling on people's faces. But in the end, they became fluffy snowflakes. Tonajul did not have heavy snow in a year. Everyone raised their heads. Before this, Brando also looked at the light gray sky, the dark clouds symbolizing the coming war. I have never been a lord, nor have I had the experience of governing a land. Amandina is the same. You are the same. As I said, he spread out his hands, letting the snowflakes fall on his shoulders. We are not different. We are all here to learn how to face all of this, all of this. Brando said, everything that is unfamiliar to us, everything that we share, and our enemies. Perhaps we will not, we are novices, learning how to walk with difficulty. The young man waved his hand, but that is not the problem. The problem is, his voice became a little louder, and his eyes swept across everyone's faces. Do you have the courage to stay, to face all that is coming, to realize that what we have done may seem insignificant, but it is the glory of the previous era, do you see? That is Erewhon's wings. The late King Eric's words have already confirmed all of this, to ignore the darkness, to let your actions be without shame, and to hold on to such a dream. Whether it is the honor, the promise, the responsibility of a man, or the duty of a lord to his people, Brando replied, just as I am standing here. I answer your questions like this. How much longer do we have to run? He pointed at everyone he was familiar with, Cornelius, Rabban, the Shire, and even the numerous mercenary commanders. Let me ask you, Brando said loudly. The white breath he exhaled melted into a thin layer of white mist in the snow, making his face look sacred and mysterious. If there is a day when you become a new noble of Erewhon, do you still remember what I have told you? Are you willing to remember that being a noble is a responsibility? The young man's words were sonorous and powerful, piercing through the cold of the early winter. But all that was heard was a dead silence. Rabban could not believe what he had just heard. He did not dare and did not want to think about the meaning behind the young man's words. The former captain of Karsuk's cavalry looked back at his companions with a stiff expression. However, Cornelius was also oblivious to his surroundings. Or rather, it should be said that the middle-aged man's heart was pounding. Of course he knew what Brendel meant by those words. This young man was telling them in public, from today onwards, you are my men. My retainers. Gather under my banner. Share honor and disgrace. Share joy and sorrow. You are my knight. Wield the sword in my hand. Expand my territory for me. At that moment, Cornelius, a middle-aged man who had been a mercenary for decades, felt a surge of energy in his heart for the first time. It was a kind of energy that could be described as boiling blood. He felt that the opportunity he had been waiting for so many years was right in front of him. He was not the only one. All the mercenaries present felt the same. Perhaps only Medisa and Scarlet didn't feel anything. To them, it was enough as long as they followed this young lord. Roman did not need to think too much. She was not by her aunt's side. Brando was the only person she could rely on. The Shire smiled without saying a word, as if he already knew what Brando was thinking. Only Amandina took a light breath. She was the only one who understood the hidden meaning in Brando's words. This young man wanted to change the rules of Erewhon. He wanted to inject new blood into the old noble system. Amandina did not know if she had heard wrongly. She did not understand why a young noble with almost no foundation would have such majestic ideals and beliefs. Perhaps it had already turned into a force that could shake people's hearts. Amandina knew that she understood. This was the first time she saw the outline of this plan, and she was already deeply immersed in it. She opened her mouth slightly and took a light breath, but she did not know how to respond. Amandina stood there in a daze. P.S. If you think it's good, please give me some support. $12,000 is really a waste of money. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 346. The year the War of the Black Rose broke out, the winter was abnormally cold. The overcast sky seemed to have frozen the air into fine powder that fluttered down. Gert had been hiding in the bushes at the top of the mountain for the whole night and was almost frozen stiff. He stretched out his hand to catch the powder falling from the sky. A trace of coldness appeared in his palm as ice crystals melted in his hand. They were snowflakes. Gert, who was still wearing his green flux mage apprentice robe, raised his head and looked at the sky. It was snowing. It was the first snow of the year. He couldn't help but recall the frequent conversations between the county and the young overlord. They talked about the situation in the north, the alliance of the Grand Dukes, and the fate of the princess. The war in the north dragged on until after the first snow. Gert was only a child of a small aristocratic family. His hometown was in Karsuk, which was also considered a remote region of the kingdom. Although he was a noble, his knowledge was limited and at most, he could only watch those big shots live their lives. His life was better than an ordinary person's, but in recent years, the situation had been worsening year after year. Gert was very clear in his heart that the reason he took the risk was to change his fate. He had studied magic under a wizard mentor for a period of time and had interacted with his mentor to understand the outside world. The chaotic world of this era had a fatal attraction for a young man like him. The chaos seemed to be full of opportunities. Thus, after his mentor passed away, Gert embarked on the journey of his dreams. However, his luck was not as good as he thought it would be. Two of the companions he met who were of similar background died during the journey. They had no choice but to rest for a while in Ferber Hill before deciding whether to return or continue the journey. But he hadn't expected that Grodin would kill all his companions. The disheartened Gert only wanted to stay behind and perish together with the noble. But sometimes, fate was fickle. On that night, he met the young overlord and participated in the battle. He was fortunate enough to follow him and became the first member of the county's wizard regiment. As the Shire's deputy, he had the opportunity to participate in the discussion between Brando and the wizard squire. Of course, he was too young to join in. The two men talked about the situation in the north, the invasion of the Black Rose of Bramanto, and Cruz. It was as if Gretel had seen a whole new world, a height he had never imagined before. It was also something that his first mentor had never discussed with him. At that moment, Gert knew that he had grasped the opportunity to realize his dream. Or rather, he had already realized it. Since then, he had become a loyal supporter of Brando. This time, he had volunteered to come to Paulus to gather information. However, it just so happened that the scout team needed a talent who was proficient in magic, so he was naturally selected. The Shire had complained to Brando about this, saying that he had taken away one of his capable assistants. But Gert didn't regret his decision. He felt that rather than staying by roadside, he might as well attract his attention with his actions. He was a person who yearned for adventure. Otherwise, he wouldn't have left home to come here. The young man stared at the sky for a long time and finally came back to his senses. Then, he rubbed his hands. He didn't dare to make too much noise in case he attracted the attention of the sentries below. From the top of the hill, he looked down at the grayish-yellow tents and the bustling campsites in the forest below. Then, he heard a rustling sound behind him. His companions were on guard in that direction. The sound clearly belonged to one of their own. Of course, there was another possibility. Gert immediately tensed up. By Cabbage, a strange password came from the forest. It was said that the Shire had taught them. Gert immediately relaxed. It was one of their own. He turned around and replied, "Ruff, who is it?" "Melf." Gert recognized the name. It was another wizard's apprentice in the same team. Melf only had a nickname and no name. The Shire had given him that name. What a lucky bastard. Gert couldn't help but think. "How is it, Gert? Is this the camp of the Night Lord Paulus?" The wizard's apprentice, who was wearing a gray robe, walked over and crouched down beside Gert. He whispered, "But Mouse and the others said that there is no camp here. This is not Lord Paulus' camp." Gert shook his head. "It's not." Melf was stunned. The young man slowly nodded and moved his frozen limbs. "They are Highlanders." "Highlanders? Aren't they fighting with Lord Paulus?" Mayhew asked in surprise. "What are they doing here? Are they planning to invade us now? Then the heavens are helping us." But Gert shook his head. It was not that simple. There are many groups of Highlanders. They might be coming for us. "What? Are you sure?" "Of course I'm sure. I know them better than you." "All right, go send a message to the receiving team." "We are preparing to retreat," Gert replied. "It's snowing. We can't hide here anymore. We have to change our clothes." Melf looked at his companions and nodded. Highlanders. The snowflakes in the sky became denser. Not long after they left the south gate, Brando bumped into a mercenary. The man was an elementalist. The young man recognized him. He was one of the Shire's men. At Brando's request, the Shire had selected those who had the ability to cast spells from the mercenaries and adventurers. There were wizards who knew some tricks, third-rate elementalists, swindlers, witch doctors who pretended to be mysterious, and a large number of apprentices to form a wizard group. Since the Shire was a gold-ranked wizard, it did not take much effort to form a wizard group. Many wizards even volunteered to leave their mercenary groups to join this wizard group. Although this matter was criticized by the leaders of the mercenary groups, Brando supported them from behind and did not cause any real trouble. Brando knew that the advantage of having a group of spellcasters was proven by both players and NPCs in the later stages of the war. Of course, the Shire had complained to him more than once that these people did not deserve to be called a wizard group. It was not that it was better to have a mixture of people from all walks of life, but Brando did not care. At least from his point of view. This was the first adept legion under his command that had taken shape. Moreover, there were many talented individuals among these people. With some training, they could form the backbone of the Wizard Association in the future. It was a pity that even though the Shire had the strength of a mentor, he did not have the experience of grooming apprentices. Thus, this wizard group was still an empty shell. However, it was not completely useless. These spellcasters who had a little bit of strength had more or less followed a mentor, or at least been apprentices for a period of time. There were even some who came from academies. They all had one thing in common. And that was that they were all literate. Thus, Brando, Amandina, the Nightsong Tiger, and the Shire used these spellcasters to deal with intelligence and paperwork. It was obvious that this person was one of the Nightsong Tiger's intelligence department. In response to Brando's question, the elementalist nodded, "Yes, my lord. The Shire asked me to tell you that you might need this information urgently." This information was sent back by those people in the north, and it said that it has something to do with the Highlanders, those people in the north. Brando was stunned for a moment before he remembered that he did ask the Nightsong Tiger and Reto to infiltrate the Paulus region to gather information about Count Randner's army. The Nightsong Tiger was fully in charge of this matter, but he knew the details of the plan. Seal had gathered some third-rate wizards or apprentices from the mercenaries and mixed them into the scout team to disguise themselves as adventurers so that they could send back information to the rear. The method of sending back information was simple, but he was the one who came up with this method himself. Animal messengers. Of course, this was not a new method, but a method of using familiars. Long before the year of the cave beasts, the Cruz people had already used this method to send back information during the November War. However, in this era, very few people thought of sending wizards to the front lines, so this method was not widely spread. But after the War of the Black Roses, the first demonic wave came a few years later. The number of talented wizards increased day by day, and this method gradually spread. In the later stages of the war, this method was already very mature. But at that time, there was a more stable alternative method, such as using magical tools. However, Brando did not have the means to do so, so he thought of this primitive method. With the animal messenger, an apprentice could send a message within a day and a night. In theory, the message could be sent back one by one through the stations. In the past, the message would take a week to reach Ferber, but now, it would only take a few minutes. However, the Nightsong Tiger and the Shire's manpower was limited, especially those who had the ability to cast spells and were familiar with scouting techniques. Thus, the Nightsong Tiger and the Shire only had 2 or 3 scouts. Their surveillance of the Paulus Knights' territory was still quite limited, and Brendel did not expect that they would obtain useful information so quickly with this level of surveillance. But now, it seemed that the nobles still looked down on these rioters. Perhaps they paid enough attention to the rioters in the war, but outside of the war, the Lord Paulus still did not guard against them. But it was understandable. Even though Brando did not have many men, his methods were much better than Erwin's regular army. Even though he did not have the self-awareness to do so, traditional soldiers like Lord Paulus would have a headache dealing with them. Sending wizards to the front lines as scouts. In the eyes of the nobles, this was not something a human would do. Only Brando, who was used to this method, would be used to it. In fact, when he first proposed this idea, not only the conservative Amandina, but even the Shire was shocked. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 347. However, after a series of discussions, Brando came to the conclusion that using the Magi as the front line was a crazy idea. The Magi were not only useful in sending back information, but also in concealment, erasing information, and evading pursuers. Even so, the Shire only supported the idea of using the Magi in the early stages of the war. Once the enemy understood the Magi's strategy, the Magi's losses would be unbearable. Brando could only accept the Shire's reasoning. He knew that the Shire was not wrong, and he was not wrong either. It was just that the time was not right, and the largest demonic wave in history was not here yet. Brando glanced at the mercenary who delivered the letter. He took the letter and opened it, but his expression instantly turned serious. Dark clouds seemed to cover his face, and it was even uglier than the gray sky at this time of the year. Scarlet and the elven princess looked at each other worriedly. They rarely saw Brando with such a serious expression. Did something happen? My lord? Medisha asked softly. Brando shook his head. The letter was very simple. It only stated that a clan of Highlanders had appeared in Lord Paulus' territory. It could be said that if this letter was in the hands of any of Brando's subordinates, it would not attract any attention. The term Highlanders was commonly used in Randner's territory. These natives were constantly at war with Erwin and the other outsiders. Lord Paulus had been dealing with them for more than half of his life. If someone else saw this letter, they would probably be glad that the old knight was in trouble again. However, this letter had a different meaning in Brando's eyes. It seems that we have to add a new list of enemies to our list. The young lord smiled helplessly and passed the letter to Medisa. But the elven princess only took a glance at it and asked after a moment of surprise, "What's the matter?" Highlanders. They aren't Count Randner's enemies. My lord, you said that Knight Paulus has been fighting against them for years. Why would they join him in attacking us? Medisha asked in confusion. The Highlanders are divided into many tribes. The tribe mentioned in the letter came from the east of Mount Greyhar, and they have always been under Count Randner's rule in name. However, the Highlanders have a strong sense of territory, and they rarely move to other regions on a large scale, much less leave their dominion. Then, Scarlet didn't know much about military affairs, but she could tell that something was wrong with Brando's tone. I don't think they're here for the slumber celebration. I don't know what Count promised these stubborn fellows, but I'm sure they're here for us. It doesn't matter, Scarlet snorted softly, it doesn't matter who comes, we will defeat them. When Brando heard this, he could only smile. He knew that this red-haired girl was just cheering him on. On the other hand, Medisha was calmer. Is it a big problem? She asked. Brando shook his head. Of course it will increase the pressure on us, but it's hard to say how much. I believe that old fox Count Randner has mobilized more than one Highlander tribe. He looked into the distance. The snow had already turned the streets into a hazy fog. It seems like I've underestimated these beasts who fight all day long. Even though Brando said it casually, he was not confident in his heart. Who knew how many Highlanders would enter Paulus? Perhaps the supply of food to these people would be a bottleneck. However, Brando did not know how long Count Randner would be able to mobilize resources in his territory. In any case, Lord Paulus's army, the Highlanders, and the undead of Madara. The young man could not help but frown deeply. Should we inform Miss Amandina? Medisha asked. Brando shook his head. Amandina was left behind at the south gate. She was responsible for supervising the mercenaries as they paid the workers. The wages were calculated using the copper coins of the free port, and each person only received a few copper coins. It was not a lot, but it was better than nothing. It could be said that the symbolic meaning was greater. Amandina's original intention was to save the money, but it was part of the Romans' plan to revive the city. She naturally could not agree to it. In the end, Amandina could not take it anymore and simply dragged the young man to the construction site. When he thought of this, Brando could not help but smile and shake his head despite his heavy heart. He recalled how little Romaine pretended not to know and tried to shirk the responsibility, but in the end, she was dragged back by the noblewoman's order. Amandina was different from him. Even if she pretended to be teary-eyed, she would not be moved. Even though Amandina was probably Romaine's best friend other than Freya, Amandina was probably Romaine's closest friend. But when it came to official matters, Amandina would not give him any face. Whenever he thought of the young man who always gave him a headache and was helpless in front of Amandina, Brando felt that it was very interesting. At that time, he was glad that he avoided the young Roman quickly. Otherwise, the young man would definitely blame it on him. Amandina might be able to keep her promise to others, but she could not do anything to this young lord. Thinking of this, he shook his head and returned to the matter at hand. The young man patted the letter in his hand. Actually, I want to know who sent this information back. What do you mean? Most people probably would not pay attention to these Highlanders because they are too common in this place. In other words, what we thought of, the person who sent this information back must have thought of it as well. Brando was a little puzzled. He knew this because he had knowledge and vision that surpassed this world. In fact, if he did not talk to the Shire about some things related to this matter, he was afraid that even the Shire would not be able to see anything from this letter. And other than him and the Shire, everyone else was the same. Then who was the person who sent this letter back? Brando was puzzled, but for a moment, he noticed that the elementalist in front of him was looking at him, as if he wanted to say something but stopped. The young man was slightly startled and asked, "Is there anything else?" "Yes, my lord." The elementalist's expression was a little strange, and he stammered as he answered, "Just now, Lord the Shire sent me another letter, saying that it was for you." "What's with the letter?" Brendel asked with a frown. "What's that guy up to again?" "My lord, do you want to see it?" "Of course." Brando said in a bad mood. Since it was said that it was for him, how could he not see it? But he looked at the elementalist with some doubts. No matter how he looked at it, the elementalist's words seemed a little inappropriate. But the elementalist's expression became even more strange. "My lord, can you turn around first?" "Turn around? What kind of play is this?" Before Brando could react, he saw the shadow of a spear flash by his side, and Scarlet had already stretched out her spear and placed it on the elementalist's neck. "Take it out," Scarlet said coldly. The elementalist was stunned, or rather, he was obviously frightened. Then, with a trembling but bitter face, he took out a strange creature from under his robe. It was his familiar. Brando only needed a glance to recognize the strange creature, of course, so did the others, because it was only a duck. Using a duck as a familiar. This time, not only Brando, but also Scarlet and Metasha were stunned. Out of the three of them, one was an experienced player, one was the princess of the Silver Elven Empire, and one was a mercenary who had participated in many battles. Most of them had dealt with all kinds of wizards, elementalists, and even witches. However, even though they had seen all kinds of strange people, they were still quite different. But they had never seen a wizard who used a duck as a familiar. Brando was stunned for a while, then he nodded. "Very good, very unique." As far as he knew, there were many wizards who used all kinds of strange tamed demons. As for elementalists, shouldn't most elementalists use fairies as their tamed demons? "My lord," the elementalist said with a bitter face, "this has nothing to do with me. I originally didn't have a familiar. This thing was given to me by the Lord of the Shire. He said that using a duck as a familiar can bring luck." "It is indeed very lucky." Brando could only helplessly shake his head. "What is your name?" This was the first time he looked at this guy carefully. In fact, this guy was just a young man about the same age as him, and he looked quite handsome. But ever since he saw this guy take out a duck as a familiar, he felt that this guy was very funny no matter how he looked at it. If this guy was born in his time, he would have been a comedian. He looked back at Scarlet and Metasha. Scarlet was fine, but Metasha also seemed to find it funny. "My lord, I was just an apprentice, they called me Red Pig." "Red Pig? That's the name of a magical beast in my hometown." Brando also remembered that it was a magical beast that was over level 30. It had a fierce temper and rough skin, so not many people were willing to deal with it. He looked at the duck in the guy's hand and coughed, "How about this, you can follow me from now on. I happen to need an apprentice." "My lord, you need an apprentice?" The elementalist was stunned. "My lord, are you a wizard?" "No," Brando shook his head, "I am an elementalist." "Anyway, don't ask too much nonsense, just follow me." "Elementalist?" The elementalist was stunned again. Elementalists could usually sense each other's presence, especially high-level ones. They would have an innate sense of oppression towards low-level existences. But he did not feel such oppression from this young lord at all. There was only one possibility, and that was that this young lord's strength was weaker than his own, or was about the same as his own. However, the elemental apprentice didn't even dare to think about this possibility. After all, this was the legendary lord who was said to be omnipotent. He had only seen this lord from afar a few times before, but he had long heard of the mysterious and powerful legends of this lord many times. But wasn't this lord a gold-ranked swordsman? How did he become an elementalist? The young man, who was nicknamed Red Pig, became more and more confused. But Brando just waved his hand at him. He did need an apprentice, but not just an apprentice. He needed an apprentice to prepare for his other plan, which had to be put on the agenda now. The appearance of the Highlanders as an enemy inexplicably made Brando feel a sense of urgency. "That's it," he said, looking at the young man, "you will follow me from now on, and I will give you a name. Let's call you Mordenkainen." Mordenkainen. The young man was stunned. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 348. Brando opened the letter. It was blank, but there was a secret mark at the top right corner. He understood and crumpled the letter into a bowl. Then, a wisp of flame burst out from his hand and burned it to ashes. The ashes fell down to the ground. Brando looked up. The Shire had brought him good news. The Druids had returned. This news made Brendel feel relieved, but he did not immediately go and meet these people. Instead, he spoke to his new follower beside him. "Mordenkainen." "I'm here." The youth paused for a moment before he realized that Brendel was calling for him. He quickly asked, "Is there anything, my lord?" "Go and get Tajiv for me." "Tajiv?" "The leader of the subterranean dwellers. You know it's in the castle right now." Brando had summoned Tajiv to the castle ever since the war broke out. However, the subterranean dweller leader was quite happy. At least Grodin did not give it such treatment. As for whether Brando intended to use it as a hostage, Tajiv did not think too much about it. It had already sworn an oath to its god, and these humans did not need to use it again. "Cover it with a cloak. Try not to let others see it," Brando said. The young man quickly nodded. "My lord, where do you want to meet it?" Brando lowered his head and whispered something into the young man's ear. The young man nodded and glanced at his lord. After confirming that there were no more orders, he turned around and ran into the snow. Brando watched the young man's figure disappear into the snow before he waved to the others. "Let's go somewhere else." Scarlet looked at Brando and regained her senses. She kept comparing this young lord's appearance with Makarov and even Eek. Scarlet blushed and shook her head. "Where are we going, my lord?" Medisha looked at her with amusement. A good place, Brando replied. The snow was getting heavier and heavier, and the streets were soon covered in a thin layer of white. There were not many people on the streets, but the warm orange light from the houses on both sides of the street made them feel at ease. Scarlett had just recovered, and this was the first time she went out this week. But the girl, who had her long red ponytail tied up again, seemed to have returned to her old life. She held her thunder lance and followed behind Hao Ren while looking at the surrounding streets with a somewhat indifferent gaze. Medisha had always been interested in the human world. She would occasionally ask Brando what it was, or what it was. The three of them walked for a while until they heard a clanking sound. Medisha's long ears were the first to pick up the sound. She was startled for a moment before she realized that they were near Bosley's forge. Bosley's forge was right in front of them. After Brendel bought the cold iron ores from Cohen and sent the magic eye gems to Bosley, Bosley's smithing factory was finally in operation. The shops here were part of Grodden's private property. This used to be A.B.'s smithy, but Bosley bought the houses on both sides and expanded it. However, having a place didn't mean that everything was going well. Bosley spent a lot of effort to recruit people, but most of them were of mixed quality. Bosley complained to Brando about not supporting his work more than once. He came from Erwin's palace and complained that Brando didn't support his work. Fortunately, the situation changed after Uriel brought in the first batch of blacksmiths. The blacksmiths were sent by Redo the Red Copper Dragon. Considering that Maxon might become the front line of the war, Redo sent almost all of his capable men to A.B.'s. Of course, this was for the long term, but it was also to show his loyalty to the young lord. In any case, it solved Bosley's urgent problem. Even though it was snowing heavily, the workshop was bustling with activity. The golden red flames from the furnaces dyed the entire workshop an orange-red color. The dazzling warm color did not fit in with the cold white color outside, forming a strong contrast. Even though Brendel was standing outside the workshop, he could feel the difference between warmth and cold because of the color contrast. "My lord." A voice called out to him. Bosley's attention was diverted from the numerous trivial matters in the workshop, and he had to spend a lot of effort to instruct these foolish fellows. Just as he was about to take a breather, he saw Brendel and the other two standing outside the workshop. Grand Master Bosley. Brando smiled when he saw him. He didn't come here to stroll around and enjoy the snowy scenery. The news of Lord Paulus's army gathering had caught his attention, and he had to slowly carry out his plan. "What is it?" Bosley asked. "My lord, are you here to check on this old man's progress?" "I wouldn't dare." Brando shook his head. "I just thought of an idea." "An idea?" Bosley was a little surprised, but when he saw the four standing in the snow, he quickly said, "Anyway, please come in." "If my lord doesn't mind the noise and filth in this place." Brando nodded and led Medisha, Scarlett, and the young man into the forge. The first batch of armors and weapons were being forged in the forge. The young lord glanced at the forge. There were only bare-chested blacksmiths and apprentices coming and going. No one was wearing a robe to instruct them. The Shire's people were not here yet, which meant that Bosley's first batch of armors wasn't the White Lion armors. "You haven't started on the magic armors yet?" "My lord, you said you weren't here to check on our progress." Bosley couldn't help but shake his head and smile bitterly. "It's been too long since I last worked. The magic eye gem you gave me is precious, I can't afford to waste it. I want to practice first." The old man looked around the forge and sighed. "Besides, these people also need to be skilled. They're still far from being skilled. You're the one who's asking too much." Brando replied. Bosley used to work in Erwin's Royal Smithing Bureau and was publicly acknowledged as the #1 blacksmith. His assistants were also well-known figures, so Brando couldn't help but look down on these people. The most skilled blacksmiths among them were only from the countryside. Not to mention that none of them had experience with Arcanitech devices, some of them didn't even have experience in forging weapons. Forging armors was more complicated than forging weapons. Not only did it require experience from a blacksmith, but it also required the skills of a tailor and a leathersmith. There were blacksmiths from these professions in the forge, and they were responsible for joining the parts together to create a complete set of armor. The entire process was extremely slow, taking several hours or even an entire day to complete. Bosley frowned as he looked at the large Arcanitech device in the middle of the forge. It was a rather primitive device that was almost 20 years old. It was used to press the chest and back plates in one go, and then use magic rays to inscribe magic arrays on them. However, the working condition of these two old machines was quite unstable, and they often had problems. Even the machines I used 10 years ago were better than these two. They're in worse condition than an old man like me. Bosley felt that he had never done such a troublesome job in his life. Tonajul was a remote and desolate place, and it was hard for him to imagine that Erewhon had a place like this. Everything in this place seemed to be a century behind the times he knew. Without Arcanitech devices, the inside of the city was like a huge garbage dump. Outside of the city was the wilderness, and agriculture was still at the most primitive stage of self-cultivation. In the era that Bosley was familiar with, which was almost 10 years ago, in the most prosperous areas of Erewhon, magic was used to nurture crops. There were even students from the academy stationed in the fields. Those elementalist apprentices could change the arrangement of the elements in a small area to make the weather more suitable for growing crops. But there was nothing like that here. In other regions, large Arcanitech devices were already used in agriculture, although this was only a part of the revolution that happened in the last 100 years. The Kurlutz people learned this technology from the Hazel people and indirectly influenced Owen's development. This technology even changed the November War and brought about the Second Holy War. However, the rapid advancement of Arcanitech technology still changed the world. Of course. Except for Tonajul. It wasn't just Tonajul. In Bosley's view, the entire Ranna region was a barren land that was abandoned by history. It was as if it had a master who didn't like magic, and it was excluded from civilization. Of course, this was only Bosley's personal prejudice. Brando knew that the poverty in the south of Erewhon was due to many reasons. It wasn't just Ranner, but also Grimoires and Karsuk. The southern border of the kingdom had always been at the edge of civilization. Due to the difference in development, the difference in geography, and the invasion of monsters, there were many factors. Whether it was Butchie, Braggs, or Tonajul, these places were like two different worlds compared to the hinterland of the kingdom. Just bear with it, Grandmaster Bosley. Brando shook his head. Even though the two Arcanitech devices were a pile of scrap metal in Erewhon, they were treasures here. When Amandina found them in Grodden's warehouse, she wanted to dismantle one of them to study the magic channeling device inside, but she was stopped by Bosley. It seemed that her decision back then was wise. At least the two Arcanitech devices were of great help to him. No matter how old these two old machines were, at least they were better than Tonajul's primitive handicrafts. Brando couldn't imagine how long it would take to realize his plan with the productivity of Abes, which was still stuck in the Middle Ages on Earth. Time waits for no one. P.S. Everyone's enthusiasm has cooled down, please support me. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 349. Bosley nodded at Brando's words. Then, my lord, what did you say you had in mind? Bosley took out a pipe from his pocket, but he looked at Brando and remembered that he didn't like the smell of tobacco. He hesitated for a moment before putting it back. How's that thing going? Brando didn't answer Bosley's question. Bosley was startled for a moment, but he quickly reacted. My lord, are you talking about that thing? We've already made more than 200 sets. The workshop has been fully operational recently. But we still don't have enough manpower. If we can expand the workshop to more than 100 people, then I'll be able to meet your requirements. 200 sets. Brando calculated that it was slightly lower than his requirements. But this couldn't be helped. It was impossible to find enough skilled workers to expand the workshop to more than 100 people. Even if there were enough blacksmiths, there wouldn't be enough magic tools. Brando didn't even consider the time and cost of crafting armor. He shook his head. Grandmaster Bosley, even if we ignore the other difficulties, the ABs won't be able to support such a large workshop. Even if we add in Maxon, we don't have iron or coal. Brando paused for a moment before shaking his head. It would be great if we could make an elemental furnace. Elemental furnace. Bosley sharply raised his head. He had to deal with all kinds of furnaces in his trade. Even if he hadn't heard of this thing from Brando, he could guess what it was. Brando nodded. An elemental furnace could directly absorb the elemental fire in the air for smelting. It was a major innovation in smithing technology. But in the young man's memory, the fire elemental furnace was only invented about 20 years later, and the inventor was Erwin. It was just that he couldn't remember that person's name for the time being. This was because in the next 2 decades, due to the skyrocketing of the mana tide, there would be many powerful people. There would also be endless inventions based on mana channeling devices. It was really too difficult to remember all of them. Moreover, these things didn't have much to do with players, and Brando wasn't a crafting player in the past. He could not help but wish that his senior was here. She was an expert in this field. However, he shook his head and discarded this unrealistic fantasy. Instead, he tried to remember that the guy who invented the fire element furnace was an elementalist, born in a noble family. As for whether he was an Erech or a Viro, Roland could not remember. As he thought about it, he gave Bosley a brief explanation of its structure. The old man's eyes lit up when he heard that. Lord, is there really such a thing that doesn't use coal? Or some other kind of fuel? Bosley's face was flushed red. He could almost imagine how significant this would be. Just from the economic aspect alone, it would save them an immeasurable amount of money. Not to mention, the purity of the flame created by the fire element was not an oxidation reaction in the ordinary sense. The significance of using this method to remove the impurities in the metal was comparable to obtaining a divine weapon for an old blacksmith like him. Yes, I read about it in an ancient document. Brando hesitated for a moment before replying, I think it's a lost technology of the Buga wizards. A technology of the Buga wizards? My lord, the Buga wizards used magical forging. Medisha frowned when she heard Brando's words, but her tone was still as gentle as ever. I don't think they used furnaces, right? Or did something change in the modern era? Brando was stunned. He immediately realized that he had misspoken. In the past, Medisha did not exist, so he could stubble as much as he wanted. But now, she was also a silver bloodline elf and knew the history of the Buga craftsmen. He thought for a moment and finally found an excuse, I'm not sure about that. After all, I'm just a descendant of the wizard tower. Medisha nodded, but I think there's a possibility. It seems to be the Myrna's way of doing things. As she spoke, she looked at Brando with her bright silver eyes. Elemental forging was lost before the War of the Holy Saints. I think the document you saw was a description of the technology of the Buga wizards against their enemies. Brando was sweating profusely when he heard this explanation. He was glad that Medisha took the initiative to cover up this big lie. He had to admit that it was Martha's blessing. He prayed in his heart and nodded, that's probably the case. At this moment, Bosley seemed to have woken up from his daydream. He sighed and asked, Sir, do you know the structure of this furnace? Structure? Brando was stunned. He thought for a moment and looked at the old man. The structure is actually quite simple. It's not difficult to draw it. Then why don't we give it a try? Bosley immediately jumped up in excitement. To this old man, the temptation of the elemental furnace was too great. He patted his chest excitedly and promised, "My lord, this old man may not have any other skills, but I dare to say that no one in Aween can compare to me in the art of forging. Why don't you tell me about it? Who knows, maybe we can really recreate it." Brando shook his head. "It's not that simple, Grandmaster Bosley. The structure of this furnace is simple, but there are a few difficulties. First, it needs a mana core and a mana conduit. Second, it needs a method to collect the elemental particles in the air. Third, it needs a method to convert the elemental particles into a continuous flame. The first difficulty requires the use of magic, the second is the use of elementalists, and the third requires alchemy. As for the structure of the furnace, I believe you can easily solve it." Brando shook his head. "But what about the other problems? Can you solve them?" Bosley was speechless. Collecting the elemental particles in the air, Medisha spoke up, "It's actually not that difficult." "Oh. Little girl, you know about it." Bosley jumped up and asked loudly. His loud voice attracted the attention of the craftsmen and apprentices around him. The old man's face reddened, but he couldn't hold back his excitement and asked again, "Then tell me, little girl. This thing is very important to us." Brando shook his head. He didn't think that this thing was that important. It was just a furnace. Although it solved the problem of fuel shortage, and perhaps it would improve Shaflan's silver smelting process, Tonajul didn't produce any iron. This was another bottleneck that could be a death sentence for Bosley's expansion plan. In his plan, the expansion of AB's factory would have to wait until his trip to Ampere Seal was over. "My lord, don't underestimate this thing. It can save you a lot of money. With this money, you can buy more iron ores, and I can create more weapons and armor for you. You can also gather more troops," Bosley reprimanded Brendel sternly. "My lord, don't underestimate this thing. It can save you a lot of money. With this money, you can buy more iron ores, and I can create more weapons and armor for you." He paused for a moment before continuing, "My lord, aren't you loyal to the princess? Without an army, you can't even protect yourself. How can you support the princess? The situation in the north is getting worse by the day. I don't think the princess can wait for the day my lord grows his wings." Brendel felt a headache coming on when he heard the Grandmaster Blacksmith's nagging, and he quickly nodded in agreement. But when he heard Bosley mention money, he suddenly had an idea and changed his mind. Bosley saw the significance of the elemental furnace, and so did the others. Not to mention how important it was to the blacksmithing and smelting industry. Even if it was miniaturized and sold to the nobles, it would still be a profitable business. Brando had decades of experience, and naturally knew that this was a profitable business. He was still worried about what goods to bring to Ampere Seal, but now it seemed that a bright future lay in front of him. Thinking of this, he quickly nodded and interrupted Bosley's words, saying to Medisha, "Why don't you explain it to the master, Medisha?" Medisha smiled and answered quietly, "It's actually very simple. You just need to use a magic array." Magic array. Brando frowned, but the release of fire elemental energy requires a magic array. The absorption and release magic arrays can't be stacked together. Also, the absorption magic array can't withstand harsh conditions, unlike the release magic array which can withstand high temperatures. If you use a reinforcement magic array, I'm afraid the absorption effect will be affected. Although Brando only had a few levels of alchemy, he still had the knowledge from the game, and this basic knowledge was not difficult for him. Let's separate them. If we separate them, what about the conduction of elemental energy? Brando knew that the conduction of magic was no longer a problem in Wonde, but the conduction of elemental energy was another problem. At least until now, he had not heard of anyone who could transfer elemental energy, unless it was done by an elementalist. But if an elemental furnace needed an elementalist to be on duty 24 hours a day, then it would need at least 6 to 7 elementalists. This investment was a bit of a loss that was not worth it. My lord, you forgot that I'm a silver elf. Medisha whispered. Brando was stunned. What did this have to do with silver elves? Little one, but at this time, he suddenly heard Orthlus's voice in his mind. I've always wanted to ask, is the silver elf girl following you a royal elf? If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 350. Little one, Orthlus's voice suddenly rang in his mind. I've always wanted to ask, is the silver elf girl with you a royal elf? Lady Orthlus, Medisha is a royal. What's wrong? Brando replied. It's nothing. She looks familiar, just like someone I know. But I don't think it's possible. She's probably her descendant. Orthlus shook her head, but if she's a royal, then your question won't be a problem. Why? One of the silver elves' silver legacies is the elemental conduction technique. Royal elves must have mastered this technique. Orthlus replied, then fell silent. So that's why. Brando looked at Medisha curiously. Do you know how to do it, Medisha? The silver elf girl nodded gently. All right, this problem is solved. Brendel knew that this was actually one of the two most difficult problems of the elemental furnace. Solving this problem could be said to have solved half of the problem, or even more than half of it, but he still asked, then how do I convert these fire elements into continuous flames? As far as I know, most of the alchemy arrays are instantaneous, but the elemental furnace needs to be stable and continuous. Is there no way to solve it? Bosley's raised eyebrows sank again. It doesn't seem that difficult, he said with a troubled expression. Of course it's difficult. The stability of the array is very high. But it's not like there's no alternative. One is to strengthen the array, but this will affect the output. The other is to use better materials, which will increase the cost. Brando thought for a while. The elemental furnace could be strengthened by the array. But the cost of the elemental furnace would be slightly higher. After all, the wool comes from the sheep. Even though it was difficult, he remembered that he had Tamar with him. It shouldn't be a problem to give it to a master alchemist. He shook his head and threw the question aside. All right, it's better than nothing. Let's move on to the next question. What about the mana conduction device and the core? I can think of a way to get some. Bosley glanced at him, and for the first time, the old man stuttered. I have contacts in Ampere Seal, Corvado, and Cipher. I can probably ask them to help me get some, but I can't hope for the largest ones. Medium is enough. Brando replied. As for the mana conduction device, Amandina had a set of primitive designs that could barely be used. That thing was even rarer than the mana core, and it was almost completely controlled by the royal family and nobles. Nevertheless, Yangming glanced at the blacksmith master in surprise. This was the first time the blacksmith master took the initiative to use his social network. It seemed that this thing was very attractive to the old man. However, what surprised Brando the most was that nobles, especially someone like Bosley, had a huge network of connections. If he could make use of this network, it would be great news. He couldn't help but ask, if that's the case, why don't you ask them to help us get some people? Aren't you lacking manpower, Grandmaster Bosley? Bosley glared at him. Do you want to drag more people down with you? I don't care about the others, but don't even think about it. The people I know are either from the royal faction or my students. I don't want them to be on the pirate ship. No, you're mistaken. Brando did not give up and continued to persuade the old man. Whether it's the royal faction or us, we're all in the same boat. We're all working for the princess, aren't we? Bosley snorted. Even though he did not believe Yangming's words, He remembered that Brando resonated with the Lionheart sword and was a little convinced, but I've already agreed to work for you, young man. As for my students, I have no right to interfere with their decisions. As for the royal faction, there's no need to talk about it. I'm not asking you to interfere with their decisions, Grandmaster Bosley. Brando shook his head and sighed. I'm not forcing them to work for me. They can also help us out a little. People need to learn to be flexible. You see, this isn't much different from helping us smuggle goods. In essence, they're working for the princess, and they're also working for Erwin's lost glory. Most importantly, we'll pay for it. We won't let your students suffer any losses, Grandmaster Bosley. This is a win-win situation. Brendel drew out a beautiful picture for Bosley as he patiently guided him along. Of course, Scarlet and Medisha could not help but laugh when they saw this. This young lord was like a demon from the scorching hell, a hypocrite with a wicked heart. They looked at Bosley, who was stunned by Brando's words, and then at Brando. The young lord quietly turned around and glared at them to prevent them from laughing and ruining the atmosphere. Brando could not help but think to himself. He had only been a leader in the game for a few years, and yet he had already mastered the art of painting a beautiful picture of himself. However, compared to the managers of large and small enterprises in his previous world, he was still a child in the presence of an adult. If those people were to transmigrate to this world, they would be able to establish a large-scale international fraud organization. No, it should be a large-scale international corporation. No, it should be a large-scale international religious organization. And it would not be inferior to the Holy Cathedral of Wind or the Holy Cathedral of Fire. Brando promised Bosley while his mind was still spinning with these random thoughts. Bosley, the royal craftsman of Erwin, seemed to have been persuaded. He hesitated for a moment before speaking. Very well, my lord. What else do you need? People. Brando said, more people. People. Bosley was shocked. He stared at Brando in shock. Why you want me to do human trafficking? Are you crazy? Erwin forbids human trafficking. Bosley's words were lacking in confidence. There were many underground black markets in Erwin, and the nobles were doing the same. It was an open secret. However, this young lord was not such a person. Bosley had always been dismissive of Brando's idealistic integrity, but as a young man and not a lord, he admired his character. Brando furrowed his brows and shook his head. What are you talking about? What human trafficking? That's too filthy. Mr. Bosley, don't bring the bad habits of the old nobles to my domain. Bosley did not choke on his words. He stared at Brando in annoyance. Didn't you bring this up first? You said you want people, but it seems that there is no other way to get more people other than buying and selling people. Then what do you mean, my lord? Bosley asked in annoyance. Brando nodded. Very well. Do you know about the War of the Black Roses? What's that? Brendel suddenly paused, because he remembered that the officials had yet to give this war a unified name. As for the War of the Black Roses, there was no such thing. He coughed and changed his words. I'm talking about the war that just ended. You're talking about the invasion of Madara. Bosley asked in confusion, but what does that have to do with the War of the Black Roses? Bosley's face turned red, but he could not help but frown. Can't this old man stop poking at my sore spot? But just as he was thinking of a way to get out of this awkward situation, Scarlet whispered, I heard that Madara is known as the Black Rose of Brahmanto. I believe that's what my lord is talking about. Bosley nodded in understanding. That makes sense. I believe that the chronicler would have named it that way. So what's next? Brando wanted to hug Scarlet and give her a kiss, if not for the fact that he did not want to let down the little Roman. But he gave up on the thought and coughed softly before continuing. The War of the Black Roses may seem like the biggest war Erwin has experienced since the November War, but that's not the case. Ever since the royal family lost control of the region, the nobles have been waging war against each other year after year. This ancient kingdom has been in deep trouble for a long time. Brando was telling the truth about Erwin for the past 20 years. Everyone present nodded in agreement. Grandmaster Bosley, do you know about the refugees in Mente? Bosley asked. Of course, some of my subordinates came from that group of refugees. Bosley paused for a moment before he suddenly realized what Brando meant. My lord, you mean, refugees? Brendel nodded. The years of war had created a large number of homeless refugees. These refugees either relied on powerful lords to become tenant farmers or citizens without personal freedom, or had no food or clothing and no fixed place to stay. Even though he did not have a detailed count, he believed that in this era of Erwin, be it in the north or the south, there would be a large number of people who were troubled by such hardships. It was easy to attract these people. A full meal and a yearning for a better life would be enough to attract them to Tonajol. What he wanted to provide was nothing more than a way for them to reach this place. Bosley quickly calmed down after his initial shock and reminded, My lord, these refugees may be real, but most of them are old, sick, or disabled. There are also women and children. A strong and healthy laborer is valuable in anyone's eyes. I'm afraid that such a good thing won't happen to you, my lord. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author. Support the original reading. Chapter 351. Brendel nodded. Of course he had considered such a situation, but it was not like there were no strong and healthy people among the old, weak, sick, and disabled. Some young people would stay with their families, but most lords would not take in a family for a single worker. This was where Brendel's advantage lay. Women could do many things, and children were the future of the fief. Not many people in this era had such foresight, but Brando had to consider Erwin's future. He waved his hand and interrupted Grandmaster Blacksmith. Grandmaster Bosley, I've considered all of this, and it shouldn't be a problem. Population is the future of a fief, and the ignorant nobles can't see that. But I don't mind teaching them a lesson. In any case, I'll leave this matter to you. Now that we have people, what about food? Bosley was still worried. Even though he did not want to, he had to admit that Brando's methods were deeply rooted in the hearts of the people. Whether it was out of selfishness or righteousness, he did not want to see the young man's efforts go to waste. Even in the dead of night, Bosley had wondered more than once if this young man was really the one who was born to fulfill his orders. Otherwise, why would he resonate with the Lionheart sword? And what he did was supported by everyone. That kind of scene sometimes really made him feel like he was looking at that person. That person who swore an oath under a glorious banner. Bosley could not believe it. Food is a problem, Brando nodded, but then he looked at Bosley strangely. Grandmaster Bosley, when did you start to care about this? Bosley's face reddened. I'm just asking. I understand, Brendel gave a mysterious smile. Food is indeed a huge problem, but seeing so many refugees displaced from their homes, this one's heart is pained, and I cannot eat or sleep in peace. So no matter how difficult it is, I must persevere. Isn't that right, Grandmaster Bosley? You. Bosley saw that Brando's words were full of righteousness, but his eyes were smiling like a little fox. He could not help but get angry. Cut the crap, you bastard. What's going on? Medisha couldn't help but cover her mouth. Of course it's not that serious. Brando shrugged. Food is a problem, but with the support of Shaflun's silver mines, it won't be a problem for the time being. Just buying won't do. Aren't you afraid that the dukes in the north will block you? The old man shook his head and said worriedly. Firstly, the merchants of Ampere Seal are all merchants. Brando raised another finger. Secondly, the Northern Fleet is still in the hands of Her Royal Highness. Of course, Grandmaster Bosley's words are also a concern. However, Tonajul isn't inherently barren. Brando thought to himself. Since he had a druid under his command, why would he be afraid of problems with farming? These turf players were much better than elementalists when it came to agriculture. Although convincing the druids who believed in the balance of nature might be a little troublesome, Brando had already set up a trap for them to jump into. They had signed such a treaty before, allowing the druids to participate in all wars to defend this territory. The food war is also a war. Brendel snickered. The old man looked at him and shook his head. I don't know why you need so many people. Tonajul already has a large population. As long as you can occupy this place, it won't be difficult to build an army. Brando did not reply. Bosley did not understand his dream. His dream was not just Tonajul, nor was it Valhalla, nor was it Erewhon. The young man's goal was the future. His journey was the endless wilderness. After the glory of the ancients, humans would once again pick up the lost flag and march into the wilderness. Erewhon would expand and become a powerful empire. And the opportunity was in the wilderness where civilization could not reach. Brando did not answer Bosley's question, but he knew that one day, these people would understand why he was doing this. He smiled and changed the topic. Grandmaster Bosley, since when did you care so much about this humble one's territory? Are you sincerely planning to join this humble one's side? The master craftsman choked and coughed loudly. After a while, he managed to catch his breath and replied in exasperation, Brat, what are you thinking? I'm just worried that you'll lose everything and drag down my career. No, I mean, hinder Her Royal Highness from reviving the kingdom. If that's the case, then aren't you going too far from the topic? Brando asked in amusement. What do you mean? Weren't we talking about a plan? How did we end up talking about food? Or do you want to change jobs with Miss Amandine, Grandmaster Bosley? Bosley naturally knew that Brendel was mocking him. Even though this young lord's character was outstanding compared to the other nobles of this generation, it was obvious that he was lacking in respect for the elderly, and he did not repent even in death. He replied snappily, I'm not as shameless as you, my lord, to snatch a little girl's rice bowl. We were talking about the elemental furnace. Forget it, I'll give up on explaining it. Bosley suddenly realized that it would be disadvantageous for him to continue explaining, so he quickly changed his words. All right, I'll listen to you, my lord. Let's get back to the topic. I've only completed less than 300 sets of the elemental furnace. Would my lord like to inspect them? Of course, it would be best if I could, Brando nodded. He wanted to see how the elemental furnace was progressing, but not here. Is there a secret room in this workshop? Of course, Bosley glared at him. Why are you being so sneaky? You're up to no good. Brando shook his head with a smile. If the old man is as honest as he claims, then why would he have a secret room in the workshop? He did not remember making any special arrangements for the elemental furnace. But he did not dare to say it out loud. Bosley might really throw the three of them out in a fit of rage, and that would be a huge loss. Bosley led the three of them through the busy workshop and opened a door in the south to enter the secret room. But Brando soon realized that he had misunderstood the old man. The so-called secret room was more like a temporary storeroom or resting room. The storeroom was not big, only about a few dozen square meters. There were many boxes and barrels placed around it. Bosley opened one of the boxes with a shovel and took out a set of strange armor. It was indeed a peculiar set of armor, at least in the eyes of most normal people. That thing really couldn't be considered a set of armor. Or rather, it was better to say that it was more like a set of failed apprentices. Because when you saw it for the first time, you would wonder if anyone could wear it. It did not have a helmet, nor did it have a collar. The chest and back plates were tightly fitted together, and the position of the hands and feet were different from a normal person's. More importantly, the set of armor was extremely heavy. Bosley had to use all his strength to take it out of the box. The old man could even bet that even if it was given to the knights to wear, most of them would not be able to wear it even if it was not for its strange shape. It was simply too heavy. In the end, Bosley threw the armor onto the table while panting heavily. "Look, this is completely designed according to your blueprint. I can guarantee that there are no changes, and I can also guarantee that no normal person would be able to wear it." Bosley's eyes widened as he glared at Brendel. "Look, this is completely designed according to your blueprint. I can guarantee that there are no changes, and I can also guarantee that no normal person would be able to wear it." He shook his head. "I don't know what you're trying to do with this set of armor." "Oh, no, it's not just one set, it's 200 sets." Brando smiled as he listened to Bosley's complaints. He was very satisfied with the set of armor. He had to admit that Bosley's craftsmanship was worthy of being called the best in Erewhon. He was known as the only divine blacksmith in Erewhon before the Second War of the Black Roses. At the very least, the set of armor required a level 60 master blacksmith to make. Before the Second War of the Black Roses, master blacksmiths were a title that did not exist even among crafting players. Even after 20 years, master blacksmiths were still considered treasures in China. It was no wonder that Brando looked at Bosley with a smile as if he was looking at a treasure. "Are you even listening to what I'm saying, you little rascal?" The old man looked at Brendel, who was smiling without saying a word, and suddenly became angry. "Of course," Brando nodded, "I'm very happy with it." "I know you're happy with it, but you haven't answered my question." "What is it?" Bosley suddenly felt a little discouraged. He felt that talking to this young man was an arduous task because he could never catch up with his thoughts. "You'll understand soon enough, Grandmaster Bosley." "Then?" "Wait a moment, I don't think it's best if I don't tell you." "Then what do you mean?" Bosley was surprised. At this moment, someone knocked on the door. Bosley was startled. It was rare for someone to disturb him when he was resting. He raised his eyebrows and shouted, "Who is it?" "It's me, Grandmaster Bosley." The voice outside shrank back. "How would I know who you are, you bastard?" Bosley saw the smile on the young man's face and couldn't help but get angry. He couldn't help but roar, "Speak, what is it? You better find a reason to convince me, otherwise I'll kick you out of here." "It's like this. They're here to see the Lord." The old man paused and looked at Brendel in confusion. Brando nodded. "Let them in." Bosley replied. The door was pushed open, and the one standing outside was the young man named Mordenkainen. Of course, his duck familiar had been put away, and this time, there was another strange guy behind him. It was a short man whose entire body was covered by a long cloak. A dwarf? Bosley was surprised. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 352. "No, you're wrong, Grandmaster Bosley." Brando shook his head. The young man closed the door. The mysterious guest took off his cloak, revealing a hunched body and a feathered robe that covered his wrinkled skin. Tadjit bowed deeply to Brando. "Subterrane dwellers?" Bosley asked in surprise. "Wait, my lord, you mean?" The blacksmith reacted quickly. The equipment he designed according to the blueprint was not usable by humans, but it was tailor-made for these creatures. "My lord, when did you come into contact with the subterrane dwellers? Didn't we fight with them?" "But then, what's going on?" The old man was puzzled. During the battle with Lord Maxon, Brando purposely sealed the news. Most of the captives were locked up in the dungeon, and no one was allowed to come in contact with them. Thus, the news of the subterrane dwellers participating in the battle was not leaked. Furthermore, Bosley didn't care about Brando's military affairs. He was focused on his smithing workshop, so he didn't know that Brando's subordinates had merged with a large number of subterrane dwellers. "My lord. You're amazing." Tajiv maintained a respectful posture, but it faced the master craftsman and replied with a sentence in Kurlutz that it was not familiar with. "So you've subdued them?" Bosley turned to Brendel and asked. Brando nodded. "Martha above." The old man shouted, "How many have you subdued?" Bosley immediately shut his mouth as he thought of a possibility. The old man stared at Brando with wide eyes and raised his trembling hand. 500. 500. That was the number Brando wanted for the armor. The young man smiled and shook his head. Bosley was oversimplifying things. It was just like humans. No matter how strong the subterrane dwellers were, it was impossible for them to be the strongest. He glanced at Tajiv. Even though the subterrane dweller was respectful to him, he wouldn't leave the fate of his tribe in his hands. 3,000, he said. Bosley choked a little and quickly held on to the corner of the table. "I understand now. It seems like my old bones can't keep up with you youngsters." He shook his head. 3,000 subterrane dwellers? Then how did the young man win? Not to mention subduing them. It was no wonder that the mercenaries, especially the younger generation of mercenaries, worshipped this lord so much. Originally, he was somewhat dismissive, but now it seemed that it was not just blind worship. "All right," Bosley replied, "I understand. Lord Paulus is in big trouble now. It's not that simple. Count Randner won't be so rash as to charge headlong into the matter. He's an old fox." Brendel shook his head. "Sir Maxon's lesson should be enough to make him more cautious." "Are you saying that Lord Paulus will have reinforcements?" "Isn't that inevitable?" Brando replied. The old man stroked his chin. "Is that why you want to arm these cavemen?" "That's right." Brando patted the armor and said to Tajiv, "Tajiv, give it a try." "My lord, what is this?" Tajiv could not see clearly, but it could hear that the armor was made of metal. "You'll know once you put it on." "Witch doctor." Tajiv finally understood that it was a set of armor and hurriedly waved its hands. "My lord. It's fine, I'm just giving it a try." Brando smiled. "This is a gift from me. You won't reject it, right?" "Gift?" The subterrane dweller was taken aback. "Your tribe isn't one of the strongest in the underworld, right?" Brando asked. Tajiv fell silent. It nodded. If it was a strong tribe, they would not have been forced to the surface. Compared to living on the surface, they were more willing to return to the underworld. However, its tribe was not considered small. It was just that it did not have a strong underworld lord to back it up. Tajiv knew that it had a hidden problem. In the tribe that its ancestors left behind for it, there were many old and weak people. There were very few people who were qualified to fight in the underworld. "It's fine," Brando did not mind, "I've said it before. If we can't improve our strength and skills, then we can focus on improving our equipment." "Equipment, improve?" Tajiv repeated doubtfully. "I plan to give your tribe 500 sets of heavy armor," Brando replied. "Heavy armor, specifically for the subterrane dwellers." The subterrane dweller was shocked by this number. 500 sets of heavy armor was a huge fortune even in the underworld. The underworld lords would definitely not use these things to arm a group of subterrane dwellers. In other words, they were a group of cannon fodder. It raised its head and stuttered, "Subterrane dwellers, don't wear armor, my lord. Subterrane dwellers don't wear armor." Brendel could not help but curse in his mind. The subterrane dweller lord, Master Siege Master Alach's assault squad, and their performance in the Third War was still fresh in his mind. The set of armor in his hands was actually the original design of the rhinoceros armor designed by Elach. Of course, he hadn't gotten his hands on the later versions, but this set of armor was ahead of its time in the year of summer and summer leaves. Brando remembered clearly that the first set of rhino armor was created about 5 years later. Are you willing to be cannon fodder? This will become history, Tajiv. The young man shook his head. I've said before, this set of armor is specially designed for you. Wait. Bosley stopped the two of them. My lord, are you saying that this set of armor has never existed before? Of course. The old man looked at the young man and was a little angry. You didn't even let these fellows try on a set of newly designed armor, and you made me make 200 sets. Bosley was almost shouting at the end of his sentence. He felt that Brando was making a joke out of him. There had never been such a thing in history. A set of newly designed armor was mass-produced without even testing it. Did this guy think it was a toy? Bosley could understand if Brando was rich enough to rival a kingdom, but he was clearly in the early stages of his territory, and it was difficult to even maintain it. The amount of iron ores used to make 200 sets of armor was almost all of the AB's reserves. It even delayed the construction of the city walls because of this. Amandina had complained to him more than once about this matter. The more Bosley spoke, the angrier he became, especially when he thought about how Brando kept saying that he was on the princess side. If everyone by the princess side was like this young man, then this damned kingdom might not even have a future. He felt that he, the chief craftsman of the kingdom, was being played by this young man. Bosley glared at Brando. If this young lord did not give him an explanation, then he would let him know that even a master craftsman like him had his own temper. And it was a very bad temper. But Brando's expression did not change at all. He was only a little surprised when Bosley lost his temper. He did not expect the old man to be so angry, but he laughed when he heard Bosley's words. Is there a need to be so angry, Grandmaster Bosley? He shook his head. How can you still laugh? You better give me an explanation, damn it. Bosley said indignantly, otherwise, I'll give you an explanation today. How do you intend to give me an explanation? Brando crossed his arms and asked calmly. When the two of them started arguing, they seemed to have forgotten about Tajiv. Of course, Mr. Mordenkainen had been forgotten from the start. I'll go on strike. Bosley stomped his feet. All right, calm down. Brando shook his head. Grandmaster Bosley, you're the chief craftsman of the kingdom. Can't you tell if this armor will work or not? It's because I'm the chief craftsman of the kingdom that I have to stop your irresponsible behavior. Bosley said angrily, but he still glanced at the subterrane dweller chieftain. He was familiar with the armor he made himself. He only needed to look at the subterrane dweller chieftain to know that there was nothing wrong with Brando's design. The subterrane dweller chieftain looked a little bigger. But since Tajiv claimed to be a witch doctor, the subterrane dweller chieftain must have a stronger physique, and the armor would fit him well. As for the subterrane dwellers with a different physique, he would only need to make some slight modifications. Bosley's anger subsided a little when he saw this, and he was surprised. Drawing a blueprint and completing a finished product with just experience alone would require at least a few decades of forging experience. Even he himself might not be able to do it. The old man glanced at Brendel and thought to himself, is this young man a hidden master? But he did not believe it and asked with some anger, you didn't make this armor, did you? Brendel nodded. He did not want to steal someone else's work. This is the design of a friend of mine, and he has done a lot of research on the subterrane dwellers. Of course, the moment he opened his mouth, the subterrane dweller became his friend. At this moment, a certain someone in the Georgandy Ridge couldn't help but sneeze. That's more like it. Brendel satisfied the old man's conjecture, and the old man did not pursue the matter any further. It's best if you don't play this trick on me in the future. Leave this kind of surprise to the youngsters. My old bones can't take it anymore. You're exaggerating, Brando replied with a smile. Of course not. I didn't do it on purpose. Grandmaster Bosley, you are now the most valuable asset in my territory. This is only a temporary job. Bosley mumbled, but he did not forget to remind Brando of this fact. But the young man's compliments still made him feel good. Brando shook his head and turned to the subterrane dweller chieftain. How about it, Tajiv? Are you willing to accept this gift? Tajiv hesitated for a moment. When Brando and Bosley were talking, it had already touched the armor. Due to the lack of vision, the subterrane dwellers were more sensitive to touch and hearing than normal humans. Even though it only touched the armor roughly, it was certain that it was made for one of its kind. It was tempted, but it knew that there was no such thing as a free lunch. The subterrane dweller hesitated for a moment and asked, My lord, conditions? Brando nodded. He was satisfied with Tajiv's reaction. Of course, he would not give the subterrane dwellers 500 sets of armor for free. Even though the subterrane dwellers and the ABEs were allies, this was not enough. The conditions are simple. Brando replied. Then he lowered his voice and whispered something into the subterrane dweller chieftain's ear. Tajiv was stunned for a moment. It hesitated for a moment, but it still nodded in the end. Deal. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 353. The 7th day of the month of slumber. After the first snowfall. The harsh winter had sealed off all the roads from the mountains of Erech to the countryside of Ampere Seal. The lobbyists of the various forces in the free port had wasted 2 months of time in vain. In the end, their efforts were in vain. The cold season finally froze the unstable situation in the north, and the ferocious rumors about the war in the north from 2 months ago had finally disappeared like a rumor without any proof. But only those who could see through all of this understood that there was a deeper layer of danger hidden under this false calm. Beneath the surface of the world that was wrapped in silver and everything was frozen was not silence. Instead, it was an outburst of patience. Swords and blades were screaming, thirsting for blood. It was as if winter had passed and spring had arrived. After the snowflakes had bloomed, what seeped into the ground was not snow, but blood. Brando knew this very well. It was just like how he knew the history books in black and white. However, when the earth went into hibernation, there was a hidden power that was ready to move under the snow. When the old knight Lord Paulus led his subordinates to this small hill in Tanagel's territory for the first time, he did not know that the news of the war in Tanagel had already spread to the desks of the dukes and lords. During this sensitive period, a single spark could ignite the situation. Everyone thought that Princess Griffin was taking the risk, but no one thought that the silver-haired girl could only accept Brando's good intentions with a bitter smile. So where would Count Randner go from here? This was a question that could only be answered with deep meaning. But no one would care about the fate of a chess piece. When Princess Griffin received the news that Lord Paulus had begun to march towards Abes, she could not help but shake the parchment with 2 of her fingers. She smiled and said to Oberway, who was beside her, Oberway, who do you think will win? Oberway bowed slightly. Reason tells me that Count Randner will definitely win, but my intuition tells me otherwise. What if he wins? Then Count Randner will not dare to act rashly. What if you lose? Erech is also inclined to let Count Randner remain neutral, which is exactly what that old bastard wants. In other words, it's beneficial to us and not harmful at all. If only your highness could realize that Count Randner is not on the same side as us. It's a pity that Makarov and Grandmaster Fleetwood can't see that. The silver-haired girl sighed as she rested her chin on her hand. Oberway did not answer immediately. In his opinion, Grandmaster Fleetwood and Count Randner were able to see this point, but it was due to their own considerations. Perhaps Count Randner was more reliable than an unknown youth. Makarov did not wish for the princess to interact too much with the youth, and Oberway was keenly aware of this. He couldn't say these words out loud, otherwise, it would cause suspicion within the royal faction. However, he believed that this intelligent princess would be able to see through it. "Tell me," Princess Griffin raised her slender eyelashes slightly as she stared at the vassal, "why did he do this? Is it because of his so-called goodwill towards the royal family?" The princess shook her head again. Her background made her naturally distrustful of such goodwill that was not related to benefits. "I'm afraid not. In my opinion, it's because of the ambition of an adventurer." Ambition? Princess Griffin blinked her eyes. But at this very moment, the old knight Lord Paulus, who was standing in the cold wind, clearly didn't know that there was a beautiful princess who was evaluating the fates of both sides. The old knight lifted his mask with his wrinkled and calloused hands and exhaled a white breath in the cold air. He looked at the distant mountains covered in white mist. At the foot of the mountain was the camp that was attacked. This was the 6th time this week that the camp was attacked. The attackers were subterranean dwellers, and they were still subterranean dwellers. The wrinkles on the old man's forehead were almost squeezed together, and his aged face was like a piece of tree bark. Behind him, the figures of the other knights came out from the forest one after another. Most of them had solemn expressions. They originally thought that the undulating hills of the Maxen region were not as dangerous as Mount Greyhar, and that the enemy, the rioters, were not as elusive as the Highlanders. They thought that they could breathe a sigh of relief, but most of them saw the upcoming war as an opportunity to relax. However, they did not expect to meet an even more troublesome enemy before they even met the refugees. "Are these damned subterranean dwellers rioting?" Someone cursed angrily. The subterranean dwellers attacked all kinds of targets, and were not limited to military targets. Sometimes, even granaries and manors were within their hunting range. Even though Count Randner's army had yet to gather, these elusive attacks had already caused the people in the territory to panic. The losses caused by the attacks were not great, but Lord Paulus was worried that it would delay the gathering of the army. Especially recently, it had developed to the campsite where the Aboriginals gathered. This was the second campsite to be attacked. The subterranean dwellers were extremely fast in the forest, and when they attacked, the Highlanders were not ready to defend themselves. As a result, the monsters broke in from the north and quickly retreated after killing many people. The terrain in the forest was complicated, and the cavalry could not spread out to chase after the subterranean dwellers. "How many people did we lose?" "Not many. A dozen or so died, but many were injured." "How many did we lose in the past week?" "Nearly 100, the knight replied, "and this does not include the losses in battle." "Why are there losses in battle?" Lord Paulus turned around and asked. It was still too early for the war to begin, and the mobilization of provisions and other resources was far slower than expected. The Highlanders' gathering speed was also not fast enough. Less than 20% of them had arrived. However, what made him curious was that he did not give any orders, so why were there losses in battle? "It's because a group of Highlanders gathered in secret to retaliate, but they were ambushed when they entered Maxen. Only 1 or 2 of them returned," the knight replied. "These fools," the old knight cursed. "Then how many people did we lose from the first attack until now?" The knight looked at each other before one of them answered. "More than 300. "But 2 weeks," Lord Paulus shook his head. He could accept this loss. If he did not take the initiative to attack, he would not be able to do anything about it. But in his opinion, this was the last struggle of the Highlanders. In the past 2 months, Lord Paulus had gathered enough information. The noble's private soldiers who had escaped from ABs had given him a lot of useful information. For example, he knew that Brando had hundreds or even thousands of subterranean dwellers under his command. With hundreds of subterranean dwellers and thousands of mercenaries, Lord Paulus felt that if he fought steadily, he would have a good chance of winning. He would not make the same mistake that Lord Maxen made a second time. In fact, the old knight knew that based on his personality, he would not even make the same mistake the first time. He caressed the hilt of his sword. He had heard that Carglass was also captured by the Highlanders, and he had been worried about his student for a long time. Lord Paulus's original plan would take about a month and a half, and he did not care even if the Highlanders lost another 1,000 lives or a third of them were forced to withdraw from the battle. But the old knight knew that numbers did not work that way on the battlefield. If what he predicted happened, it would be a fatal blow to the morale of the Highlanders. The Highlanders might even fall into chaos. He could see that the Highlanders were pressuring him, trying to force him into a decisive battle. But things were not that simple. The Highlanders who were ambushed were the best proof of this. Lord Paulus knew that he could not act rashly, but on the other hand, the incessant chattering of the Highlanders gave him a headache. Their words were not without reason. The subterranean dwellers had gone deep into the forest and burned down one of Lord Paulus's granaries. This made Lord Paulus suspect that there was a loophole in Schaflun's plan. The subterranean dwellers could only enter Lord Paulus's territory through that direction. But Schaflun's spies reported that everything was normal. Lord Paulus even sent out a second batch of spies, but they did not find anything out of the ordinary. This made the old knight curse Perkins for being in charge of Schaflund. It was a sieve that anyone could infiltrate. But he did not think that if it were not for this sieve, his men would not have been able to infiltrate. Lord Paulus touched his sword and suppressed the impulse in his heart. He shook his head and said, "Let's go back." "My lord," the knight was puzzled, "what about the subterranean dwellers? Have the Highlanders withdraw their defenses and change the route of their supplies? We also need to relocate the granaries. The enemy is in the dark while we are out in the open. We need to be more vigilant, but this will waste too much time. Why don't we just attack them directly?" "If you think that way, then your enemy will be happy," Lord Paulus replied coldly. "The undead of Madara, the Highlanders, and even the food and other supplies are not in place yet. If you lose Lord Paulus as well, then where will Count Randner put his face? We have a few thousand men in our hands, and the Highlanders' army is nearing 2,000, the knight said. "Even if they add in the subterranean dwellers, they still won't be a match for us, right? That old fool, Lord Maxen, also thinks the same way. Did you see what happened to him? But if we do this, it will affect the time we have to gather, my lord." "That's fine too. It's best if we delay until the month of spring. It's not a good sign to send out troops in the winter." The knight shook his head. Even though this kind of harassment was harmless, it was no different from a slap to his face, and he had no way to retaliate. He was a cautious person, and the enemy seemed to have seen through this point. However, the only thing he was confident about was that he would not make the decision to send out his troops early because of his anger. The old knight believed that he had seen through the enemy's desperate struggle, and he had to fight steadily and steadily. He had to trap the enemy bit by bit and not give them any chance to break out of this situation. He would slowly get back at them for the humiliation he suffered now. Delay until the month of spring. Won't Count Randner blame us for that? 3 months, with Martha above, how much food do we need? My lord, if you do this, Count Randner will kill us. On the contrary, Lord Paulus looked at his old subordinates. The longer we delay, the better. You have to look further ahead. The battlefield is not limited to Tonagel. Before this war ends, Lord Randner will not cause trouble for you. There are some things that cannot be measured by money. Even though the old knight was a pure soldier, his experience allowed him to see through the waves behind this seemingly calm situation. Of course, if we can do it well, Count Randner will be able to rest easy, that's for sure. The knights echoed. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 354. Lord Paulus thought that he had seen through Brando's intentions. But the old knight would never understand what kind of existence was fighting against him on the other side of the forest. Just like how Brando was familiar with every lord of Erewhon, whether they were in the past, present, or future, whether they were powerful or poor. He was familiar with them like he was familiar with his own fingerprints. From the year of summer leaves to the beginning of the Second Era, he had interacted with every lord of Erewhon, big or small. If Lord Paulus knew that Brando was able to call out his nickname from decades ago, he might have reconsidered his choice. But there was no if in history. When Brando received the news that the old knight had retreated from his study in Abes, he couldn't help but smile. He threw the report from Raven back onto the table. Raven was the name he gave to the first-line Magi scouts. Because they often used ravens to transmit information, the nickname spread like wildfire in the army. What a pity. Rabin also read the report. The former captain shook his head in disappointment. That old man is really cautious. If he didn't act rashly, we would have won half of this war. It's not a good habit to place your hopes on the enemy, Captain Rabin. Amandina stood beside Brando and looked at him coldly. As time went by, her prestige in the group increased day by day. Even though she was reprimanding him, it did not make Rabin feel that there was anything wrong with it. It was as if it was a matter of course, and it was the way it should be. Rabin smiled. I just feel that it's a pity. Now that he has retreated, we will have to face a tough battle. That's not necessarily true. Brando replied softly. He knew that the old knight was cautious, but he had an unyielding character in his blood. Just like how he understood the old knight's preferred style of fighting and what kind of choices he would make. This so-called report was just a small trap he had arranged. No matter what choice he made, it would not be out of his expectations. Amandina glanced at him from behind. She had known about this plan since the day Tajiv left the city, and his arrangements had left her in disbelief. It did not seem like a strategy, but more like a prediction. But now, this prediction had come true. Amandina was also a little dumbfounded. She looked at Brando's back in a daze. Not necessarily. Rabin did not understand. Lord Paulus graduated from the Royal Academy when he was young and participated in the November War. He is the most serious of the Academy's officers. Brando replied, Did you know that on the wall of the Royal Academy, there is a sentence written in Crew's language, to the knight's goal is to prevent the other party's goal. This sentence is the core of Erewhon's military philosophy, and it is regarded as a classic by all the officers who graduated from the Academy. Rabin nodded. Even Cornelius and Medisha nodded in agreement. Rabin was born in the army, so he was not unfamiliar with this saying. However, Cornelius had decades of experience in the field, so he could understand the truth behind this saying. Cornelius had the same experience as Cornelius, and he could see the truth behind this saying. As for Medisha, the princess' understanding of war did not need to be explained. So it's the same for Lord Paulus. Amandina snapped out of her daze and whispered, Is that right, my lord? Yes, my lord. Brando continued, That's why I sent the subterranean dwellers to harass, plunder, and invade Paulus's territory. We are like cornered beasts, and we need to find an opportunity to break the stalemate before Count Randner's army gathers. Isn't that our situation? Rabin asked. Yes, Brando nodded, but is there really such a foolish enemy? Would he tell you the truth so that you can complete a critical strike? Brando leaned back in his chair, not looking like a lord at all. Amandina's brows were furrowed, and Falern's expression was not any better. However, the young man seemed to be in a good mood, and he blurted out a game term. Critical strike. It's an ancient language, Brando lied without batting an eyelid, it's called critical strike. Rabin nodded in agreement. That's why this is the reverse way of thinking, Medisha whispered. If we ask for a battle, he will not let us do as we wish. But on the other hand, according to the strict way of thinking, the enemy will not expose his weakness to us so directly. He will definitely find a way to hide his goal. Unless this is a trap. Rabin continued. What kind of message is this trap trying to convey? Cornelius asked. The enemy wants to stall for time. Rabin replied. He had obviously put himself in Lord Paulus's shoes. Then the way to destroy this goal is to send out troops as soon as possible. But what if this is a double trap? The discussion quickly became heated. So no matter what, there are only two choices left. Amandina pulled herself out of this train of thought and calmly answered, either we wait for the army to gather, or we immediately send out troops and cut the Gordian knot. But Medisha shook her head. Military calculations aren't that simple. After all, this isn't a rock-paper-scissors game that relies solely on analyzing the enemy's mentality, the Silver Elf Princess replied. Some things can't be hidden, such as military strength, resources, morale, weather, geography, and possible reinforcements. These two choices and this information are enough for Lord Paulus to make a choice. Also, there is the factor of personality. Brando added. After Medisha's reminder, Rabin regained his senses and looked at Brando in confusion. Then my lord, where is the trap? According to the Silver Fairy Princess, Lord Paulus should be able to make the correct decision easily. And it seems that the old knight did indeed make the correct decision. Just like what the young lord said, they were like cornered beasts fighting for a chance to break the stalemate before Count Randner's army gathered. But now that Lord Paulus chose to wait for the army to gather, they had lost this precious opportunity. Isn't that right? Rabin saw Brando shaking his head and smiled. Didn't I already set up the trap? All of you are in it, and you won't be able to detect it. What? Everyone was shocked. The young lord smiled and tapped his forehead. The so-called limitation of thinking is that I asked you a question that is neither yes nor no, and you fell into a whirlpool of choices because of this question. But have you ever thought that this is a real war? There are thousands of possibilities in a war, and there are not only two choices. If you can't jump out of this maze of thinking, then you won't be able to see the third choice. Everyone present was stunned. The third choice? Rabin asked with a frown. If Lord Paulus chooses to attack, then he will be attacked head-on, and we will break the stalemate. Brando replied, but of course he won't be so stupid. I don't think even Grodin will make such a low-level mistake. But if he chooses to retreat and give me 2 or 3 months to delay the war until after the month of spring's dawn, then I will still welcome him. Brando shrugged. What do we lack? Time. But time is not necessarily in our favor, my lord. Amandina's brows were furrowed as usual, as if her brows had not relaxed for the past month. Rabin looked at her and reminded her seriously, frowning too much will cause wrinkles, Miss Amandina. The noble lady rolled her eyes at him. Anyway, I'll let you take responsibility for it, she shuddered slightly. Brendel smiled faintly, as if it was something that gave him a sense of accomplishment to be able to make his assistant relax. He smiled and explained, don't worry, time will be on our side in the end. He was not speaking carelessly. Ever since the Druids returned to his territory, he knew that they would have news about Valhalla. This was no different from history, and he made a series of arrangements for it. He ordered Tajiv to harass Lord Paulus and delay the old knight's attack. All of it was to achieve this goal. Only Brando knew what Valhalla meant, so he had to delay the war as much as possible until the legendary territory was under his control. After that, everything would be fine. Knowing this in his heart, he looked at the others. They looked at him suspiciously, but at least they knew that this young lord never lied. But won't that old bastard notice that something is wrong? Rabin still felt that it was a little strange. Did you notice it? Brando asked. But that's only for a moment. A moment decides everything, and the final outcome of a war can be changed by 1 or 2 small details. Brando shook his head. The biggest taboo for a commander is to be indecisive, and changing a decision repeatedly is a taboo. Moreover, if he decides to retreat today, he will have to deal with Tajiv's harassment from now on. Even if he realizes it, he will have slowed down the pace of gathering his troops, and it will be too late for regrets. Then doesn't that mean he will lose no matter what? Rabin asked. I gave him a test paper, and the two choices were arranged by me. Why won't he lose? Brando replied, sometimes you need to change your roles, but following your opponent's rhythm is not a good thing. Brando suddenly stopped talking because he felt the surroundings become quiet. All of his subordinates were looking at him strangely as if they were looking at a monster. The young man felt awkward. It was not a profound method, but something that Insursta had played around with. During the Second War of the Black Roses, Sir Black had humiliated the old man like this, and Brando was only using it as a reference. So what should we do? Rabin asked, what should we do? Do your job well, Brando replied, this is the second thing I'm going to tell you today. I'm going to leave the territory for a trip that will take a month or more. He clasped his hands together and interlaced his fingers. I don't want the territory to be in a mess when I return. My lord, you are leaving again. Amandina frowned. Schaflund. It's a secret. The young man put his finger to his lips. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidien.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 355. After deciding on the itinerary, Brando began to prepare for his trip to the Black Forest. However, he did not leave immediately. Instead, he waited for a few more days. After confirming that Lord Paulus had retracted his defenses, Brando was able to carry out his plan with ease. On the day of his departure, he arrived at a courtyard in his castle. Your swordsmanship has improved again. Coden bent down to pick up the sword and put it back on the weapon rack. The old swordsman looked at Brando with envy and helplessness, but he was also looking forward to it. I'm old now. I'm no longer your opponent. Brendel did not try to be humble, but he smiled shyly like a young man. Ever since the discussion, Brando's schedule had been increasing day by day. Everyone was preparing for the trip, but he seemed to be a little relaxed. The battle took 10 minutes, and he won in the end. The young man was not too surprised. After the battle in the underground, and with the guidance of the female knight Orthless, his swordsmanship had improved by leaps and bounds. He could not be compared to the first time he fought with Coden. His military swordsmanship was stuck at level 16+2, and there was no further progress. The channel for him to invest in his skills was also grayed out. Brando knew that his swordsmanship was nearing its limit. After reaching the peak of the master level, he would have to rely on repeated practice or an epiphany one day to invest in his swordsmanship. Today, Brando was wearing a black cruise traveler's uniform, which was developed from the warrior culture of the Tower people. It was usually made of some kind of woolen material. The top was like a shirt, but the sleeves and trousers were unusually loose. He put on a pair of gauntlets and riding boots. Adventurers and nobles usually wore a double-layered belt to hang their swords. However, Brando had specially made Halran Gaia's scabbard for a broadsword. He sheathed the sword and replied, "Times have changed, Mr. Coden." Coden looked up at him but did not say anything. Coden didn't say anything, but Brando didn't press him either. He took out a piece of cloth and gently wiped his sword as he thought about what had happened a few days ago. The meeting with the Druids was rather harmonious. Andrew had yet to return from the loop of trade winds, so an elder named Grey Raven came instead. Grey Raven symbolized the elves of the storm. To be able to use this title as a code name, it meant that this elder was proficient in druid spells within the wind domain. The wind domain represented the sky, and the druids of the sky domain often enjoyed a high status within the druid organization. Therefore, Brando guessed that this person might not be an ordinary outer circle elder like Andrew, but an inner circle big druid. Druids were connected to each other by a secret organization, known as the Druid Assembly. The structure of this organization was circular, and the inner circle was called the Trade Wind Council. Every member was an archdruid, and they communicated with each other through the winds of summer, autumn, and winter thousands of miles away. Only spring was the season of Naya. The druids had to give way to the wind so that they could not disturb the goddess Rise. As expected, the druids brought him a piece of news that he had not expected. Grey Raven told him that they might have found Valhalla, but in fact, they had encountered a little trouble. The loop of trade wind seemed to be undergoing some unusual changes. The laws of the Black Forest were once again rearranged. The druids encountered fog and strong winds, and their sense of direction in the forest, which they were so proud of, was no longer effective. The archdruid said that the trees there seemed to be repelling them. If not for the fact that they were not hostile, it would have been difficult for them to even walk out of the forest. Brando pondered for a moment and guessed what they might have encountered. The power of the moon of magic was growing stronger with each passing day, and the chaos in the darkness was becoming restless. Even the forest was affected and began to show signs of change. This was a difficult problem, and there was almost no way to solve it. The only way to solve it was to force their way in. But this required strength, and the druids couldn't do it. Although the archdruid seemed to have the strength of a gold-tier warrior, they knew too little about Valhalla. It seemed that he had to go there himself. But that was fine as well. It was exactly what he wanted. He set aside a month and a half, and thought that it would be more than enough for him to arrange this trip. But just as he was thinking of this, a sudden argument interrupted his thoughts. "Stop. I want to see your commander. I know he's already back. Stop talking nonsense. A captive should have the self-awareness of a captive. Why do you have so many demands?" This was the voice of a soldier. Brando raised his head and looked in the direction of the voice. It was the dungeon, and a funny expression appeared on his face. This was not the first time he had heard of such a dispute. "Humph. You untrustworthy bastards. The last time I defeated that bastard, he promised to let me see your commander. If you have the guts, make him come again. I guarantee that I'll beat him until he pisses his pants." "Shut up." The soldier scolded. "Captain Cornelius went easy on you. Didn't you see that his sword was broken in the fight? Then why don't you make him change to a better sword and fight me?" The voice did not hide the sarcasm. "Brat, do you want to be taught a lesson again?" The soldier was clearly impatient. Then there were a few cries of pain. Brando quickly saw a young man wearing a white shirt running out from behind the bushes. The young man's light blonde hair was slightly messy, and he seemed to be in a sorry state. However, he held a sword in his hand. Brando noticed that the sword was not stained with blood. When the young man ran out from behind the bushes, he was surprised to see someone outside. When he saw that Brando was holding a sword, he subconsciously thought that he was one of the guards and immediately went forward to greet him. Brando was slightly surprised. He wondered why he let someone run out, but before he could finish his thoughts, he saw the young man lunge towards him with a sword in his hand. The young man's sword was pointed at Brando's right arm. It was obvious that he did not want to kill him, but the speed of his sword was extremely fast and his hand was steady. This showed that he had a good foundation in swordsmanship. This surprised Brando as he knew that his four captains, Jutta, Cornelius, Rabin, and Cornelius, were not a match for this young man. Damn, military swordsmanship, at least level 8. Brando thought to himself. No wonder the Nightsong Tiger, Rabin, and Cornelius were almost unable to kill this young man. He was indeed a talent. His first thought was to knock the young man's sword away, but he changed his mind. He wanted to test the young man's strength. Brando changed his stance twice in an instant. He flicked his sword upwards and blocked the young man's sword, then pushed it outwards, causing the young man's center of gravity to tilt. Even though Carglae's attack was neutralized, Brando was merciful and did not knock his sword away. He almost thought that his eyes were playing tricks on him. That ordinary-looking guard seemed to be a master swordsman. But that was impossible. The young man gritted his teeth and attacked again. However, Brando's Halran Gaius softened and slapped the young man's left and right arms. He did not use his full strength, nor did he use Earthquake. Instead, he used his immense strength to push the young man back. In the end, the young man fell to the ground on his butt. Full of flaws, but commendable. Brando thought to himself. He saw the young man stand up again and subconsciously raised his sword. He wanted to see if the young man knew any other swordsmanship. But at that moment, he saw Carglae's throw his sword away and raise his hand. "I surrender." Carglae stared at Brando with his light gray eyes. He knew that the young man was a master swordsman. He did not stand a chance. But he only felt annoyed. If he knew this would happen, he would not have run in this direction. Now that he thought about it, he found it laughable that he took the initiative to attack the young man. He looked at the old man and thought that he should have run away from here. But when he saw Coden looking at him with a smile and the old swordsman's slender fingers and countless calluses, he realized that his defeat was inevitable. "Who are you?" Carglae asked curiously. He allowed the soldiers who caught up to him to tie his hands behind his back. The soldiers were angry at him for injuring others, so they did not hold back, causing him to grit his teeth in pain. Fortunately, the young man did not kill anyone. Otherwise, the soldiers would have beaten him up in front of their lord. Brando did not answer but looked at the young man with interest. He looked at the young man and suddenly had a new idea. "Aren't you afraid that I'll kill you?" "Why would you kill me?" Carglae was not afraid. "There's nothing to gain from it." "Kill the chicken to warn the monkey," Brando replied. "Then you can do it." The young man puffed out his chest. "If I blink, I will no longer be a man of the Huberto family." "So a man only cares about himself and not your father?" Brando asked. "What does being a man have to do with my father?" Carglae was puzzled. Brando was surprised. After all, the culture of this world was different from his original world. He looked at the soldiers again. "Why didn't you kill them?" The young man shook his head. "Why do you always talk about killing? I'm much stronger than them. I don't need to kill them to escape. But if both sides have the same strength, then I can only fight with my life." He answered honestly. "But he's your enemy. I can't kill all of them." Carglae raised his eyebrows and shrugged. "What's more, if I'm caught, I'll be the one in trouble. Just like now. You've thought it through." Brando suddenly found the young man interesting. "Well, do you still want to know who I am?" "Didn't I just ask?" "Then what should you call me?" Brando looked back at the soldiers. The soldiers quickly took a step back and lowered their heads. They placed one hand on their chest and saluted. "My lord." "My lord." Brando turned around and saw the young man staring at him with his mouth agape. His mouth was wide enough to swallow an egg. He could not believe his eyes. You are." Brando nodded and laughed in his heart, but his face did not show it. "Yes, I'm the one you want to see." To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 356. When the soldiers saw the young man trying to stand up, they quickly went up and held him down. They looked at their lord with inquiring eyes and asked, "My lord, should we take this guy down?" Brando looked at the young man. He knew that this was the second son of Sir Menta, but he found it interesting that the old-fashioned gentleman should have such an interesting son. He had already changed his mind and shook his head. Let him go. Let him go. The soldiers were stunned and looked at each other in confusion. Let him go. Brando repeated. The soldiers loosened the thick hemp rope around Carglae's wrists. The young man frowned and rubbed his wrists. Even though the soldiers did not beat him up, they were not polite to him either. He looked at the red marks on his snow-white wrist and couldn't help but frown. However, the young man was more concerned about Brando's intentions. He raised his head and stared at Brendel with his light gray eyes for a while before asking, "Are you really from this place? Are you trying to say that you're the leader of the mob?" "I wouldn't dare." The young man smiled awkwardly. In fact, Carglae was surprised when he realized that the other party was a young man about the same age as him. Not only did he surpass him in swordsmanship, but he was also the leader of the mob. The more he looked at Brando, the more he felt that he had lived in vain for the past 10 years. It was just like what Lord Paulus had told him, staying in a small place like Tonagel would only limit his strength. "But I'm curious," Carglae rubbed his wrists and asked, "why did you let me go? If I told you that I wanted you to work for me, would you believe me?" Brando asked. "No." The young man shook his head. "Why should I work for you?" "Then what if I told you that I'm Griffin Corvado? I'm a secret envoy sent by Princess Oderfeis to establish a secret base here to keep Count Randner in check. Would you believe me?" Not only Carglae, but even Coden stared at Brando with his mouth agape. The young man did not seem to believe him at all. He looked at Brando as if he was looking at a lunatic, but the old man seemed to have woken up. He thought about the relationship between Brando and the royal family of Corvado and what Brando had done in the past few days. The more he thought about it, the more he felt that the young man's words might not be so unreliable. At least some of them weren't lying. "This joke isn't funny at all," Carglae frowned, "but since you're the lord of this place, I'll say it's okay." Brando smiled and took out a silver brooch. "This brooch is called the Silver Coat of Arms. It's the token of the Wong family's Knight Order." The young man was stunned. "How do I know if you're lying to me?" Coden was also skeptical. He had heard of the Silver Coat of Arms before, but he didn't know if the one in Brando's hand was real. The more suspicious the old man was, the more he felt that Brando was telling the truth. Otherwise, how could it be so coincidental that these well-trained rioters managed to kill Grodin? Brando put away the brooch. In fact, the brooch was real. It was sent along with a private letter from Grodin. The letter was simple. It mainly told him that the royal family appreciated young men like him and did not mention anything else. This was just a routine reply, and the whole letter was watertight. Even if Brendel had this so-called Princess Griffin's handwritten letter, it would be useless. However, the young lord still treated the letter like a treasure and carefully kept it. Amandina could not understand his actions and complained about the stinginess of the royal family of Corvado. Only an idiot like him would not be able to see through it. But how could Brando not see it? The regent princess used to be the dream lover of many otakus. As they grew older, most of them eventually realized that their love was just a youthful longing, but they could not let go of the most sincere memories in their hearts. Especially when the letter from the princess who had passed away was placed on his desk once again. It would be a lie to say that he wasn't excited. "Alright, let's not talk about it," Brando continued. "I heard that you were planning to bring a few servants to the north to answer Grodin's call to revive the Corvado dynasty." Carglae stopped what he was doing. "Seems like you know quite a lot. You're more outstanding than most of the people I've met." "Tonagel can't restrict your movements," Brando said as he tried to recall Carglae's experiences in the past. Unfortunately, he did not manage to find anything. This was not surprising. There were many young people like him in Erewhon, but not all of them were able to shine in the end. As the waves washed away the sand, those who were not strong enough naturally hid away. However, there were more who were not lucky enough. Many of them died on the way to Vlada. Bandits, monsters, cultists, and lords with ill intentions. The countryside of Erewhon was not safe in this era. You sound like you're mocking me. Carglass frowned. No, Brando shook his head, I'm serious. So, are you willing? What do you mean? Carglass was stunned. I'm lacking an adjutant. Are you kidding? Carglass' eyes widened. Brando shook his head, I said that I'm serious. I think you're capable enough for this position. Most importantly, you have the willingness. Wait, Carglass interrupted, I never said yes. Then are you willing to stay in Tonajal for the rest of your life? Are you willing to miss this era? Are you willing to become a lord in the countryside and an old man in the end? Why does it sound like you're cursing my father? Carglass frowned. He did not act like a captive, but more like a guest of Brando's, but why should I believe you? I'll give you a chance to try. But once you've boarded a pirate ship, it won't be so easy to get off. I understand, the young man said warily. If you want to persuade me, you have to let me see some benefits. If I fall for your trick without risking anything, won't I seem a little too incompetent? When the young man said this, he was already moved. He was born to be a restless person. Whether it was relying on the princess or following this young man, he only hoped that he would not be like his father and live an ordinary life. The boldness in Brando's words made him feel that this young man might be able to fulfill his dream. He thought for a moment and asked tentatively, Who are you, and what do you want to do? The courtyard fell into a dead silence. Even Coden felt that this question was a little abrupt. But Brando replied, I've already told you who I am. As for what I want to do, Carglass smiled. His smile was a little meaningful under the rare sunshine of the winter afternoon. If I say that I want to grab Duke Arek's beard and give him a good beating, then go to Madara to settle my debt, would you believe me? Carglass was stunned for a moment, then the young man's eyes lit up. He nodded fiercely, good idea. Coden looked at the two lunatics and finally felt that he was getting old. Back when he was with Tobbs, he was also fearless. Their regiment was like the demons of the November War, causing all the enemies on the battlefield to tremble in fear. However, the times were different, and the present was different from the past. The old swordsman looked at the youth's eager face and hurriedly dragged him to the side. He whispered to him, Are you crazy, Brendel? He's Lord Maxon's son. If you kidnap him, that stubborn old man will fight you to the death. You better think twice. Fight me to the death. Brando was both angry and amused. Wait until he gets out of my dungeon first. You're not going to let him out. Coden suddenly felt that this young man was a little too much. On the one hand, he had kidnapped the son of a noble who had painstakingly raised for more than 10 years, and on the other hand, he was going to lock him up in the dungeon. Why don't you ask him if he's going to let Lord Maxon out? Brando pointed at Carglass. Coden looked back at Carglass and shook his head. If Lord Maxon knew that his son had been betrayed, he would probably beat him to death. If Brendel told him to slow down this matter, he would definitely raise both hands in agreement. Young people these days. Coden looked at Brando helplessly. All right, don't worry. I'll take good care of Lord Maxon. I have high hopes for Carglass. He'll definitely have great achievements in the future. Coden shook his head. Brando, is what you said before true? What? Don't play dumb, Coden said fiercely. I'm talking about the princess. It's fake. Scram. Coden kicked at Brando, but he was already prepared and dodged. He smiled and shook his head. Master Coden, even if it's true, it's still a secret. How could I say it so casually? Coden was stunned, but he quickly thought that it was possible. But this young man had done too many things that were both true and false. Coden could not completely trust him and could only suppress his suspicions. Brendel looked at the old swordsman and interrupted his thoughts. "Old man, are you interested in going on a trip? Traveling?" Coden was stunned and looked at the young man strangely. What was he up to this time? To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 357. While Coden was puzzled by Brando's strange suggestion, Amandina and Scarlet had arrived at an abandoned manor near Abes. The two ladies' carriage entered the depths of the manor and were received by a few mercenaries who had been waiting for them. The moment they got off the carriage, they saw a group of rowdy youths not far away. The manor had been renovated nearly a month ago. The abandoned broken walls were refurbished with wooden walls. Now, the size of the manor was much larger than before. Red pines were planted on the periphery, and in the coming year, it would grow into a lush green area, enough to cover all the scenery in the manor. There were hidden sentries in the pines, and they could support each other on the wooden walls. The defense here was tight, and it was Brando's secret camp. It was also the training camp for the future White Lion infantry. The manor was divided into two parts. The southeast quarter was provided to Brando's mercenaries and adventurers as dormitories. These people would protect the manor and maintain order before the first batch of White Lion infantry matured. In the future, Brando would either merge them into the new army or transfer them to other places. However, this depended on how loyal Cornelius was to the group. The person in charge of this place was the handsome middle-aged mercenary leader with silver hair. Cornelius was originally suspicious of Brando's decision to transfer him out of Abes, but after understanding the importance of this place to Brando's group, he quickly realized that it was not a matter of estrangement, but of an important position. The regiment commander immediately became proactive and organized the camp's affairs in an orderly manner. Brando was a good judge of character. Cornelius was mediocre when it came to commanding, but this meticulous man had an unparalleled talent when it came to logistics. This could be seen from the current order of the camp. Everything was in order, and the sentinels in charge of guarding the camp did not have any bad habits left over from the past, although they were either mercenaries or adventurers a month ago. Of course, there were unavoidable exceptions. Amandina got off the carriage and stood under the shade of a mangrove tree. Scarlet, who was responsible for her safety, stood silently by the side. The tree beside them was a common evergreen tree in Tonajol. This evergreen tree would dye the area dark green even in winter. Amandina stood under the shade of the tree and looked at the noisy scene not far away. There were about 60 youths there. The mercenaries were maintaining order in the field, but most of the youths were picked from the locals and had not seen much of the world. When they saw a carriage stop under the shade of the tree, and a noble lady came down from it, they immediately became restless. "Look, there's a noble lady over there. Why would a noble lady show her face in this place? Is she the Lord's daughter? My lord is young, I've seen him before. Then she must be his fiancée. That's possible." Amandina couldn't help but overhear the whispers. She listened quietly, then turned to look at Scarlet. "What's wrong?" The girl swayed her red ponytail and looked back at Amandina with a slightly startled expression. "Nothing." Amandina replied and turned back to look at the youths. She looked at the youths. This was one of the Lord's plans. The formation of the White Lion Legion was on Tonajol's agenda from the beginning, but building a powerful legion was not done overnight. Brando planned to train a group of youths to be the backbone of the White Lion Legion in the future. They would be officers, but also his personal night guards. Most of these youths came from the nearby areas. They were the sons of farmers, craftsmen, or small merchants. Some came from the manors, the descendants of nobles, mercenaries, and adventurers. But they had one thing in common. They were all less than 20 years old, and some were even teenagers. They were like a piece of white paper, full of plasticity. They stood there, whispering and discussing with each other. They were uneasy and curious about the future. They had only been here for 3 or 4 days, and had only undergone simple training. Perhaps they had already been whipped by the mercenaries to remind them of the importance of discipline, but it was inevitable that they had a youthful immaturity and restlessness. Only a few young men who came from mercenaries or aristocratic families were slightly more composed. They stood out from the rest of the crowd and easily attracted the attention of the young ladies of the noble families. "Who are these people?" she asked. "They are the children of the nearby manors." The mercenary next to her replied. "Children of the manors?" Amandina was puzzled. The children of the manors were the descendants of nobles, so why would they come here? They snuck out. So they are the children of nobles who are looking for excitement. Amandina looked at the youths. "Have you investigated them?" Her words were unnecessary. Since they were here, they had no choice but to be sent to the Black Forest. No matter what kind of mentality they had, they would be sent to the Black Forest. Amandina could only hope that these youths would not regret their choice. She took out the pocket watch from her bosom. This pocket watch was given to her by Brendel. Even though it was just a cheap silver-plated pocket watch, she had always used it carefully and treated it like a treasure. She did not plan to change it again. She opened the watch and saw that it was almost 11:00 in the morning. She looked up and saw a mercenary running towards her from the field. The mercenary stopped in front of her and saluted her with one hand on his chest. "It's almost time, miss," he replied. Amandina nodded. The mercenary bowed to her again and ran back. Amandina took a deep breath and blinked her eyes. She saw 4 large carts coming in from the other side of the clearing. Of course, these carriages were different from the 4-wheeled carriages used by the nobles. Compared to those exquisite handicraft-like things, these carriages were more like large, inferior products. Originally, these caravans were used by merchants and farmers to transport goods. However, the mercenaries did not care about their use. They numbered the youths and gave them a number plate. The number plates were made by Brando based on the Schaflund silver mine. They were also made of wood, but under the rough workmanship were Tamar's magic imprints. They could be identified through a red crystal that was imprinted with detection magic. These crystals were in the hands of the people in charge of this project, but other than Brando's crystal that was permanent, the others had to be replaced regularly. After the youths got on the carts, the clearing became quiet. It was as if the discussions before were just an illusion. Amandina let out a sigh of relief. She watched the last person get on the carts and turned to Scarlet. "Let's get on as well." "Aren't we going with them?" Scarlet asked. "We're going to the other side." Amandina turned around and walked towards the carts. "Our lord's whereabouts are a secret. We can't let others see our carts." The red-haired girl nodded. She took a closer look at Amandina and felt a little admiration for her meticulousness. "Do you want to go?" She followed Amandina and asked behind her back. "What is it?" "The dark forest." Amandina stopped, but this time she did not answer. At the border of the dark forest. Brando walked down from the carts and felt the lazy afternoon sun. He could not help but stretch his body. He raised his head and watched as the rays of the sun shone through the rows of black pine trees, forming a dazzling halo. The sparse sunlight in the forest fell on the grass. Then he heard a grumble behind him. "I knew you were up to no good." Brando turned around and saw Coden jump down from the carts with a gloomy expression. Ever since the old man left Schaflund, he was dressed in military attire. He had a long sword, a dagger, a short bow, and a quiver of arrows. He looked more like an adventurer than a traveler. He took a deep breath. Even though the dark forest was filled with danger, the air was refreshing. Even though the air was cold and damp, it had the freshness of the vegetation. Coden lowered his head and saw that his boots had landed on a thick layer of grass. He stomped his feet, causing the pests to scatter in all directions. Centipedes, scorpions. Coden shook his head. This place is really cursed. I heard that you fought outside the borders of civilization during the November War. Brando turned around and asked. Don't even talk about that. Coden did not want to think about it. The November War was so fierce that they had to retreat into the dark forest to fight. It was also the only time after the New Age that the commanders had to recklessly devise a strategy. Both sides of the war were in a frenzy, like two dying beasts clawing at each other's throats, but no one could kill the other first. The brutality of the war was beyond the imagination of the later generations. In a battle, there were often only a few dozen people left in the organized army. Sometimes, only a few people survived. Mountains of corpses and seas of blood could be seen on the battlefield. It was common for dozens of miles of land to be covered with corpses. It was a hellish scene in most cold weapons battles. Brando understood and did not mention it again. Carglass, however, was the third to jump out of the carriage. The young man was the last to alight. He grabbed Mordenkainen off the coachman's seat and dragged the poor elementalist a short distance into the forest. Let me go. The man who had the duck as his familiar protested loudly. However, in terms of strength, he was no match for a swordsman of a higher rank. Carglass ignored the man and looked around. He took a deep breath and asked, Is this the dark forest? What? You're not satisfied? Coden turned around. It looks similar to the forest in Harrigal Mountain. Carglass stared curiously into the depths of the forest. It was as dark as an oil painting. I hope you don't regret it. Regret? Carglass shook his head and grinned. I did at first, but now I don't regret it at all. Why didn't I think of going into the dark forest for an adventure? That's because you were just a little lunatic. You haven't met a big lunatic yet. Coden looked at Brando and complained in his mind. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.cheedian.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 358. That's because you're just a little lunatic. You haven't met a big lunatic yet. Coden glanced at Brando and cursed in his mind. But the old swordsman still turned to look at Brendel and asked, All right, where are the boys that you mentioned that need to be taken care of? Brando smiled. The reason why he asked Coden to come out was simple. He wanted to use this opportunity to train the young lads. The Black Forest was full of dangers, and it was the best place to train them. With the young lads by his side, it would be beneficial for him to pass on his ideas to them. But the problem was that the dangers in the Black Forest were unpredictable. It was not easy to protect the young lads that he had painstakingly trained. Brando could not do it alone. He needed manpower. The Shire, Medisha, and Scarlet were all gold-ranked warriors. The 12 mercenaries of Lopez were also at the peak of silver-ranked, but Brando knew that he could not bring anyone else with him. The current situation in the ABs did not allow him to mobilize too much of his forces. If not for the fact that Scarlet could not be too far away from him for too long, he would not even want to bring the red-haired girl with him. Because of this, he had to use the excuse of traveling to bring Coden here. His goal was to get the old swordsman to help him. He believed that even though Coden said that he was cautious, he would still help him when the time came. As expected, Coden only hesitated for a moment before agreeing to his conditions. As long as he did not directly oppose Count Randner or become his subordinate, he did not mind coming out to relax. Of course, even so, he would not treat Brando well. "We're almost there," Brando replied. He looked into the distance and saw a black dot appearing in the wilderness outside the forest. The black dot quickly grew bigger and turned into a caravan. Four large caravans slowly drove into the forest and stopped one by one. The mercenaries in the caravan recognized their lord. They immediately got off the caravan and bowed to Brando. "My lord." "Is everyone here?" Brando asked. "Yes, my lord." "Where's Scarlet?" "Miss Scarlet is also here. She's with Miss Amandina." The mercenary replied with his head bowed respectfully. Brando raised his head and looked at the last caravan. The door opened, and Amandina and Scarlet alighted. But he was surprised to see the wild elf sisters in the caravan as well. They were the last to alight, and the younger sister of the sisters waved her hand when she saw Brando. "My lord." Because the mercenaries of Lopez had been carrying out heavy missions for a long time, this little girl called Tia had not seen Brendel for a long time. She looked especially excited at this time. "Why are they here?" Brendel nodded to the wild elf girl and looked at Amandina inquisitively. Amandina, Amandina, she looked at the four caravans in the caravan, as if anything, she would tess. She raised her head and looked at Brando. "Miss Falerne is here to take care of my lord's daily needs. So she's really going to be my personal maid." Brando almost coughed. He looked at Amandina in surprise. "I don't need a maid." The wild elf's face darkened. She stood behind Amandina and glared at Brando with her emerald green eyes. Her eyes were saying, "Behave yourself, my lord." Brendel was at a loss for words. He did not think about being a maid at all. It was purely because Falerne's job overlapped too much with that job. He thought for a while and changed his words. "What I mean is, I don't need to be taken care of. I'm not one of those people who would open their mouths and stretch out their hands for clothes, but you're the Lord of Tonajol." Amandina said seriously. "That's just a title, Amandina. Isn't it the same in the past?" "The past is the past." Amandina looked at him and said with a hint of reprimand, "You're the Lord of Tonajol now. How can you not have a maid?" She glanced at Brando from the corner of her eyes. "You wouldn't want the Lord of the Shire to take care of your daily needs, would you, my lord?" Brando finally choked on his words. He shuddered at the thought of that scene. He looked at Falerne. In fact, Amandina had been instructing Falerne to do this kind of work for him. He was used to it even if he was not used to it. In the end, he raised his hands in surrender. "This girl is not bad," Coden said to Brando as he looked at Amandina from the side. "She's a noble's daughter, and she's beautiful. Your grandfather will be satisfied with her." "What do you mean?" Brando glanced at the old man who wanted to stir up trouble. "What?" Coden seemed to have realized something and said with a smile, "You're not satisfied. Then I'll introduce her to Carglass. After all, he's going to be your assistant in the future, and he's going to have the same rotten taste as you." Brando coughed and looked at Amandina. "Stop talking nonsense," he replied. "Lecherous thoughts but no guts. You're not as good as your grandfather in this regard, little guy." This time, Coden wasn't angry at all. The old man patted him on the shoulder and walked away with a victorious look on his face. He was in a good mood. It was rare for him to catch Brando's sore spot. Brendel turned back to look at Amandina, and her face flushed red. She lowered her head and whispered, "Prepare yourself, my lord. Time is limited. You're going back alone." After Coden's reminder, for the first time, Brendel felt that this noble lady who always went against him was actually a little cute. Amandina nodded her head. "It's too dangerous." Brando shook his head. "'Cause she wants to go with my lord." Amandina originally thought that it would be better if fewer people knew about Brando entering the dark forest. Moreover, the journey from the border of the dark forest to Abes was not long, and the territory of Abes was under the control of the mercenaries. She did not think that there would be any problems. "I mean, you should come with us," Brando replied. "Aw." Amandina let out a low cry. Because of her own abilities, Brando almost never brought her along when he went out. Amandina felt a little regretful about this, but she knew where her abilities were and did not think too much about it. However, Brando's sudden request was far beyond her expectations. She knew what kind of place the dark forest was, and she would only be a burden if she went. I don't think it's a good idea." Amandina wanted to refuse, but there was a small voice in her heart that told her to agree. The thought of being able to travel and adventure with this young lord made her a little hesitant. It was as if she had returned to the days before. Amandina, who had always been calm and rational, was a little hesitant. But Brando did not come up with this idea on the spur of the moment. He had Kishi bring Amandina over for a reason. He would have many things to do in the future, and he could not stay in the territory all the time. Amandina would be his first assistant in the future, and she would be the first to take over Valhalla. It was important to maintain the territory's normal operations, so he had to let her familiarize herself with the territory. Valhalla was different from ordinary territories. Once it awakened, the shock it would bring to mortals would be enormous. In order to accept this shock in the shortest amount of time, the fastest way was to have someone personally activate it and experience the awakening process together with it. "It's fine, this is actually part of the plan," Brando replied, "but this plan is not irreplaceable. The dark forest is very dangerous, so I'll leave the choice to you." "What about the Roman lady?" Amandina frowned and hesitated. "If I'm not here, no one will be able to watch over her." "Don't worry." Brando did not expect her to be worried about this, but he shook his head. She won't do anything rash." Amandina was surprised. She had been in the Abes for several months, and there was not a day when the merchant lady did not encounter some small trouble. The Roman's muddle-headedness made her wonder how the merchant lady survived for more than 10 years. Because of this, she had even revered Roman's aunt for a time, wondering what kind of outstanding woman could have taught this guy to be so obedient. But Brando knew that in his absence, the little fellow would be more obedient than anyone else. Because only he could see clearly that little Roman's actions were nothing more than to attract his attention, just like the little tricks animals use to attract their mates. Even though the merchant lady was muddle-headed, she was naturally clever, and it was because of this that Brando found her cute. "So what?" he asked. Amandina paused for a moment, and seemed to understand this point. She thought for a moment and blurted out, "Of course I'm willing." Amandina immediately coughed lightly. I'm not afraid of danger if I work for my lord." Brando smiled faintly. "Thank you." He immediately pointed at Tia, who was curiously looking at the grass and trees in the forest. "Then what's the situation with this young lady?" He thought that it was understandable for a sister to come and take care of his daily life. Moreover, he might be able to obtain unexpected rewards if he brought along a lucky girl. But what's with this little sister? Could it be that Amandina knows the legendary buy one get one free? Buy a maid and get a loli for free. If that's the case, this business can be done. She came at Master Tamar's request. Amandina answered. Brando finally remembered that this little loli was Master Tamar's assistant. But why did Tamar ask her to come? Wait, he suddenly thought of a question. She's here to collect materials? Amandina nodded her head. P.S. It's a little late, sorry. Also, in the future, I won't change the number of chapters for the first, second, and third chapters of the same title. Chapter 359. Brando understood Tamar's thoughts. The dark forest was a barren land that had never been reclaimed. Humans rarely set foot in this place. The laws that were affected by chaos would be reset every once in a while. The forest was grotesque and variegated. Buried beneath the surface of the ground were treasures that humans could never imagine. Due to the influence of the moon of Mana, not only were there all kinds of monsters in the forest, even the magical plants were full of vitality. There were even places where magic gathered to form large open mines of magic crystals. Gems flowed in streams, and gold coins gushed out from fountains. These were not just descriptions in poems, but they could also become reality here. The dark forest was not only a forbidden area for civilization, but also an unknown treasure trove in the eyes of humans. However, after the Second Holy War, many races on the continent had lost their strength due to internal strife. The glorious scene of night entering the dark forest could not be seen again. However, the bizarre legends of history had survived. Legend had it that the forest was rich in rare materials. The river flowing with moonlight could bring the dead back to life. The red veins beneath the earth hid the blood of sages that could turn steel into gold. The dragon's graveyard had dragon bones that were more precious than diamonds. There were also leaves that could create an illusion of paradise if they were burned. These were the greatest treasures in the eyes of alchemists. As long as they could obtain one of these materials, they could create a legendary item that would leave their name in history. Every alchemist yearned for the dark forest, but most who dared to enter the dark forest died in the stomachs of monsters. This was another fact. The dark forest was also a place where monsters gathered the most. Master Tamar could have entrusted this task to me directly. Brando shook his head. Actually, I was careless. I forgot that the dark forest is the treasure trove that every alchemist yearns for. Actually, I think Master Tamar has his own concerns as well. Amandina smiled faintly and replied. What do you mean? You'll know if you ask Diameter. The noble girl rarely kept Brendel in suspense. Brando immediately looked at Falerne. The wild elf elder sister turned her head expressionlessly and shouted to her younger sister, Dia. Sister. The younger sister quickly ran back, but when she saw her elder sister's unfriendly expression, she obediently maintained her distance and asked carefully, Is something the matter, sister? My lord wants to ask you a question. Falerne replied. Sir Lord. Tia turned around and stared at Brando with widened eyes. Her sister was much scarier than this lord. Truth be told, compared to Falerne, she was more willing to get closer to this lord who often told her stories during their travels. In this regard, Falerne was a failure as an older sister. Tia, why did Master Tamar call you here? Brando asked. Collect the materials, my lord. Wasn't that normal? Brando turned around to look at Amandina. Amandina covered her mouth and giggled. She gestured to him with her chin, indicating for him to continue asking. Brando was slightly surprised. He thought for a moment and continued to ask, What materials do you have? That's what Master Tamar said. Tia began to recite, but she was immediately glared at by Falerne. The little girl's head shrank back slightly, and she became much more obedient. She pouted and whispered, It should be easy to find lesser magic crystals in the forest, so we should collect as many as we can. There are moon crystals, gold crystals. There are also magic plants, blood-stained roses, and whiptail flowers. In terms of minerals, it's best if we can find mithril in the open, but sacred silver is also good. There's also frost iron, Nasser ore. I heard that the dark forest has spring water that can preserve eternal youth, archangel's wings, dragon's poem, golden core. Stop, stop, stop. Brando quickly stopped Tia when he saw that she had no intention of finishing. The list of materials was fine at first, but it became more and more ridiculous as it went on. The spring water that could preserve eternal youth was already something that only existed in legends. Archangel's wings, dragon's poem, golden core. These were all divine artifacts. It seemed that Tamar really treated the dark forest as a treasure trove for the dwarves. All he had to do was to move the items out of the dark forest. If it was really that good, the humans would have swarmed into the dark forest a long time ago. Even though the dark forest was filled with countless treasures, it was equally dangerous. The outer regions of the dark forest were less dangerous and less mysterious. However, all kinds of minerals and rare magic plants were also rare. So, the latter part of Tamar's list was obviously just a pipe dream. However, Brando could understand Tamar's thinking. After all, not everyone had the chance to enter the dark forest and come out alive, let alone bring anything out. Staying alive in the dark forest was already a luxury. Not every lord would dare to throw their golden core into the bottomless dark forest. After all, no one knew if they would lose their men and not even be able to find anything. Brando dared to do so because he was familiar with the area north of the Karanaw Mountains. After all, he was once a player. Only players could risk their lives to explore the dark forest. But after giving it some thought, the young man suddenly had an idea. He was worried about the training plan for his young men. Now that he had Tamar's list, it was simple. He planned to spend most of his time on the road and the rest of the time on the map. Zhang Hing thought that he could divide these people into 3 groups, one for himself, one for Scarlet, and one for Coden. Then, after camping every day, each group would be graded based on their performance and the things they found. This way, not only would there be competition between groups, but it would also foster teamwork between groups. It was a good idea. Brendel made a draft in his mind, then turned around to inspect his men. But before he could do that, he heard a surprised shout, "You're right. You're right. Muriel." Brando recognized Cargly's voice. He turned around and saw the young man dragging the red-robed Mordenkainen through the crowd and striding towards a young man who had just gotten off the carriage. "Cargly's. You. Why are you here?" The young man was confused at first. Then, he blinked his eyes and looked at his old friend. Brendel saw that the young man had long blonde hair that was rarely seen here, and his eyes were as blue as the sea. He was wearing a set of Kurlut's travel attire that was similar to Brendel's, and the long sword on his belt had been confiscated. He looked slightly slender and feminine, and stood there like a woman with long hair that reached her shoulders. But even if he was a woman, he was still a rich man's daughter. "I understand now." The young man reacted and opened his mouth slightly in realization. "Your father was defeated. So you came along as well." "Ha," Carglass looked at his old friend and smiled casually. "I thought you weren't here. I didn't think that Lord Maxon would lose even with you around." The young man's blue eyes were filled with worry as he furrowed his brows. "Did you join them, Carglass?" "Yes," Carglass nodded nonchalantly, "but then again, why are you here, Muriel?" Of course, he knew who these young men were, but he was surprised to see his friend here. "I was captured by those mercenaries. I was just passing by with my squire," Muriel blushed. "You snuck out, right?" Carglass saw through his friend's predicament. I didn't." All right, we all know about you. Don't pretend. Don't worry, I'll protect you. But I have to say, you're in big trouble this time. My lady, you're going to the dark forest. Are you ready?" Carglass suddenly showed a gloating expression. "Don't call me that." Muriel suddenly got angry and glared at him, but then her eyes widened. "I'm going to the dark forest. Why else do you think you're here?" Carglass raised his head and looked at the forest. "Oh right, I forgot to tell you. This is the border of the dark forest." Muriel's face turned pale and her body swayed, but Carglass quickly caught her. "What are you doing? Isn't it just the dark forest? Besides, I'm still here." He reminded her in a low voice and pointed at the mercenaries around them, indicating that they should not make too big of a commotion. How can I go to the dark forest? Muriel was at a loss. Carglass, you have to help me. No, I think this is an opportunity, Muriel. Carglass shook his head. What opportunity? Muriel was confused. Didn't you always want to get rid of your bastard father? This is an opportunity. I think my new lord won't give in to your father, Carglass smirked. He suddenly felt that this was a good idea. But what can I do here? Muriel still did not understand. Besides, I don't want to go to the dark forest. There are monsters in the dark forest. We will die. Carglass touched his forehead and lowered his voice. My lady, you are a reserve priestess. Do you really need to be so timid? He suddenly realized something and looked around vigilantly. He lowered his voice and whispered something into Muriel's ear. Muriel was puzzled at first, but soon her eyes lit up and she nodded vigorously. Brando watched as Carglass and the young man walked to the side. Their voices were getting softer and softer until they could no longer be heard. But he did not listen too much. Once they entered the dark forest, these two sneaky fellows would not be able to do anything. He had plenty of time to slowly observe them. But what made Brando curious was that Carglass' friends could only be nobles. The young man's temperament seemed to confirm this point. But why were there nobles among the young men he recruited? Brando was not arrogant enough to think that the nobles and abbeys would support him at this time. Unless they did not want to lose their heads, they would be in big trouble when Count Randner came to settle accounts with them in the future. He turned around and looked at Amandina with a puzzled expression. Who are these people? Nobles. I heard that they are from the manor. You mean there are more than one of them? Brendel felt that the situation was getting more and more strange. He did not want his personal guards to be mixed in with unknown people. Even though the background of the manor's disciples could be considered clean, and perhaps the nobles around Ferber would not support him yet, he believed that it would not be long before that happened. But this situation was still a little strange. Amandina nodded her head. How did they come here? They snuck out. That's what the mercenaries said. Amandina replied, It seems like they came because of your reputation. Your reputation has spread far and wide. Interesting. Brando could not help but touch his cheeks and asked a little shamelessly, Am I that famous? Amandina raised her head and rolled her eyes at him. If you want to know the future, please go to www.chidien.com to read more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. Chapter 360. Traveling always seemed to be between anticipation and uneasiness. You would be caught in the middle when you were least prepared. The Tower people had a saying, the hardships of traveling can destroy all ambitions. This tribe, which was rich in merchants and adventurers, had a profound understanding of traveling. In the blink of an eye, Brando and his team had been in the Black Forest for a week. Although Coden had suggested that Brando set up camp outside the forest and set off after one night, Brando thought that they did not have time to waste. Besides, he was more experienced than Coden in the Black Forest, so there was no need to waste time. The depths of the Black Forest were like layers of emerald clouds. Supported by the black tree trunks near and far, they covered the sky densely. Light seeped through the gaps between the clouds, dyeing the surroundings green, while the backlit areas were almost inky black. Pillars of light shone in the darkness, and dust rose and fell under the light. Spots of light fell on the knotted roots. Under the roots, the emerald green pool in the forest was calm, and ripples would occasionally appear when a water spider slid across the surface. Light and darkness intertwined, outlining a quiet and strange scene. But it was actually close to evening. Brando was holding a notebook, and on it were various notes that were emitting fluorescent ink. Black Mage, Moonshine, Four-leaf Clover, Witch's Misery. Black Mage symbolized mystery in the secret language of the witches, and was used to extract the state of mind for meditation. Using level 3 alchemy could obtain Breath of Tranquility, which was the main ingredient of meditation incense. Meditation incense was a popular item in the Amber Sword, and it allowed the practice of mystic-type professions to achieve twice the effect with half the effort. Under the shroud of mist in the quiet room, it was easier to understand the mysterious existence in the dark. This was better reflected in the psychic incantation. In the game, it increased the speed of gaining EXP by 5%. As for level 7 alchemy, he could extract one of the lowest level 2 materials in the Amber Sword, a product called Mysterious Essence. It could be consumed directly to increase one's bloodline, but it could only be used once. Moonshine was a mage's flower, which nurtured mana. Consuming it directly would restore about 1 mana. However, after level 5 alchemy extraction, pure mana water could be obtained. Together with the bottle, it would be a beginner mana potion. Four-leaf clover represented luck. It was rare in the wild, but not rare in the Black Forest. This plant could be used in almost all magic potions to increase the success rate. However, Brando knew of a unique method that could be used to extract the essence of luck using level 8 alchemy. It could be used in all kinds of alchemy, including forging and the creation of magic arrays. The witch's pain was probably the material of some kind of poison, the agony poison. This kind of poison with a distinct smell was inferior in the eyes of the nobles who were good at scheming. It was worthless. However, that was not how it was actually used. The cultists used it as a dual element of suffering and poison to summon beings from the lower realms. The infernal demons, Lord of Suffering, or the Queen of Malice. The witch's bitter plant was strictly prohibited by the rules of the Holy Cathedral of Fire, but these rules couldn't stop those who really knew the value of this plant, the disciples of the Black Flames and the Sheep's Head disciples. They were willing to pay a high price or even murder to get this plant from others. Of course, Brando was not necessarily afraid, so he kept this plant. These were the results of more than 40 young men under him this week. In fact, these young men had nothing in the first 3 days of entering the Black Forest and complained incessantly. However, Brando naturally didn't let them go on an excursion. As long as someone slacked off, there would naturally be mercenaries who would mercilessly drive them forward with a whip. Every day at dawn, the young men would be awakened by the mercenaries. Some of them tossed and turned in the cold and damp environment of the forest, unable to fall asleep, and might have just fallen asleep. However, the training schedule didn't care so much. Even if they dragged their tired bodies, they had to complete their daily homework. The content of the training was actually not complicated. In addition to the necessary hurrying, there was also group fighting, and some swordsmanship and fighting skills. Then, every evening before the camp, they would collect materials for Tamar. Of course, it was called cooperation. Survival training was also a very important part of the training. After a week, the number of materials recorded in the notebook had increased, and the value of the materials had obviously begun to increase. This meant that they were leaving the border of the Black Forest and entering the outskirts of the wilderness. Brando finished recording the second group's harvest and used a quill pen to mark a point on the parchment to indicate that the recording was complete. The 60 young men were divided into 6 groups, and each group was appointed a leader. The leader of the second group was a young man named Mars, who came from Fern's mercenary group. He was a lower iron-ranked expert, serious in handling matters, and had strong organizational skills. However, he was a little rigid. But rigidity wasn't necessarily a bad thing. Brando raised his head and glanced at Carglass, who was not far away. The young man was leaning against a tree and wiping his long sword. This sword was a bit like the commanding sword of the year 377 before the November War. The sword had a wavy handle and the style of the sword leaned towards lightness. Brando liked this style very much, so the swords that were distributed to the young men were also of this design. The sword was the work of Master Bosley, so the quality was not a problem. Brando's design was obviously a success. The young men, regardless of whether they had used a sword before or not, loved the sword very much. This was far beyond the young man's expectations. However, he reacted quickly and immediately took the opportunity to elevate the sword to a symbol of honor. He told the young men that the sword was the symbol of the White Lion Guards. As long as he was a member of the White Lion Guards, he would have to live with this symbol of honor and the beliefs that the sword represented. The young men had privately asked Brando what the sword represented. Brando thought for a moment and replied, bravery, pioneering, and unyielding, a sword that symbolizes integrity. This statement was widely accepted by the young men who worshipped knight and romance. Brando thought for a moment and recovered from this memory. He turned a page and gently moved the quill pen in his hand. On the upper right corner of the next page, he wrote, 16th day of the month of slumber, clear. The black forest began to become dense. Sometimes we passed through places where not a trace of light could be seen even in the daytime. The treetops were filled with huge spider webs and fist-sized cocoons. Moths and polypods were densely packed on the tree trunks in the darkness. Strange thorns began to appear in the forest, such as the witch's pane. This means that the team is gradually leaving the forest border area. We saw traces of monsters for the first time in the whole day. From the shape and the traces left behind, it should be black wolves. At this point, the young man's quill stopped, and the tip of the quill gently left the paper. Magical creatures were a reflection of the distortion of magic power in the prime material plane. They were divided into several categories, including ferocious beasts, corrosive creatures, warp creatures, shadow beasts, abominations, gods and demons, or nightmares. Black wolves were a type of shadow beasts. Shadow beasts were relatively low-level monsters, but even these low-level monsters could reach as high as level 25. The black wolf had a pitch-black body, blood-red pupils, and white dagger-shaped fangs. It was difficult for physical damage to deal with it in battle because the wounds of shadow creatures healed very quickly. However, its fangs could easily pierce through any kind of armor with an armor level lower than 2. In other words, there was no armor below plate armor that could withstand a blow from these monsters. Even plate armor could only rely on the chest and back plate, which had the highest defense, to barely withstand a blow. However, Brando did not announce this news. The Guardians tacitly chose to remain silent. They wanted to see how the young men would react to a sudden attack after a week of training, especially combat training. As for the danger, it was negligible. In front of any gold-ranked existence, these black wolves were no different from the most docile puppies. This is the 7th day in the forest, Brando. He finished writing this paragraph and looked around. The forest was not a peaceful scene. The young men were divided into 6 groups and fighting 12 stone leopards created by the Halran Gaia. The 6 obsidian leopards were either squatting or lying on their stomachs not far away, lazily watching the battle. They covered their noses with their paws and squinted their eyes. They did not seem to be interested in the battle between their own kind. They did not understand why the humans were fighting so happily. Their own kind obviously did not use their full strength. They looked left and right, thinking that if they were in the battle, they would have bitten off someone's neck. Of course, the young men did not seem to realize that these seemingly docile cats were interested in their necks. Otherwise, they would have shuddered. But at this moment, they felt even more uneasy when they saw Scarlet, Coden, and Gaspard standing at the side. The captain of the security cavalry was the commander of the mercenaries. It could be said that the mercenaries' duties were the heaviest. Other than supervising, they also had to act as protectors. At least when they first entered the forest, the mercenaries had seen the young men trying to sleep on the wet ground more than once. They were responsible for patrolling at night, kicking the young men up with their boots and lifting their blankets to show them the centipedes and venomous snakes that were as thick as an arm. Needless to say, this method was very effective. Many of the young men were scared out of their wits, and after that, they obeyed the orders of the mercenaries. However, Gaspard now had another job, which was to score the young men's performance in the battle. The group with the lowest score would be sent on a 3-mile cross-country trip. 3 miles was nothing in the plains, but in the Black Forest, it could be fatal. Leaving in the evening, sometimes you would not be able to return until midnight. As for dinner, you would have to hope that your companions would leave something for you. Of course, there was usually no hope. To be continued. If you want to know what will happen next, please go to www.chidian.com. There are more chapters. Support the author, support the original reading. You're tuning into the LoveLore Library YouTube channel. We're so grateful for your support, and don't forget to subscribe to join us on this incredible journey through captivating stories. Your generosity through donations truly makes a world of difference, as it's the primary source of revenue that allows me to expand and enhance this channel for you. Thank you from the bottom of my heart for being a part of this adventure.